Imagine standing at the edge of a small hilltop settlement in central Italy, sometime around the 8th century before the Common Era. You are surrounded by marshland, thick forest, and the muddy banks of a river. There is nothing here to suggest greatness. No marble temples, no grand forums, no legions marching in perfect formation toward the edge of the known world. There is just a cluster of mud brick huts, a handful of Iron Age farmers, and a river they call the Tiber. And yet from this extraordinarily ordinary beginning, something would grow that would swallow continents, birth entire legal systems, engineer wonders still standing today, and leave an invisible stamp on virtually every nation, language, religion, and government that followed. The story of Rome is the story of how ambition, discipline, war, betrayal, genius, and extraordinary luck can turn the smallest ember into the greatest fire in human history. We live in Rome's shadow, whether we know it or not. When you drive down a straight road, you are following a design Romans perfected. When you turn on your tap, you are benefiting from an engineering tradition they pioneered. When you look at a courthouse, a parliament building, an arch, a dome, a calendar, a legal code, or even the alphabet you are using right now to read these words, Rome is there. The language spoken by priests in Catholic churches around the world today is Latin. The names of the planets in our solar system are Roman gods. Phrases like Veni Vidi Vici, Carpe Diem, and Et tu Brute echo through thousands of years of culture. Roman law became the foundation of legal systems across Europe, Latin America, and beyond. The very idea of the West, the concept of civilization as a force that can spread and transform the world, owes an enormous debt to Rome. But Rome's story is not just a story of triumph. It is a story of extraordinary violence, of slavery on an industrial scale, of political corruption so brazen it would seem theatrical if it were fiction, of emperors so monstrous they became legends of cruelty, of civil wars that shook the ancient world like earthquakes, and of a final, slow collapse so dramatic and so total that historians have been arguing about its causes for centuries. Rome teaches us what human beings are capable of at their most brilliant and at their most brutal. And that tension, that duality between civilization and savagery, between order and chaos, between ambition and ruin, is what makes its story endlessly compelling. To understand how Rome became Rome, you have to start not in Rome itself, but in the geography that shaped it. Italy is a peninsula that juts southward from Central Europe into the Mediterranean Sea, like a boot kicking a football into the waves. That shape is significant. Italy is long and relatively narrow, flanked on the west by the Tyrrhenian Sea and on the east by the Adriatic. The spine of the Italian peninsula is the Apennine mountain range, running almost its entire length and creating natural barriers between different regions and peoples. Unlike Greece, which was so mountainous that it fractured into isolated city-states, Italy had enough fertile lowland to allow larger political formations, particularly in the west, where the plains of Latium offered rich farmland and the Tiber River provided fresh water and a natural highway into the interior. The Italian peninsula before Rome was a complicated mosaic of different peoples. In the far south and in Sicily, Greek colonists had established thriving cities centuries before Rome rose to prominence. They called this region Magna Graecia, or Greater Greece. In the north, the Po Valley was home to Celtic tribes who had migrated south from Central Europe. In central Italy, you had the Latin tribes, the Sabines, the Umbrians, and other Italic peoples. And cutting right through the middle of this cultural patchwork, in the region north of the Tiber and south of the Alps that we now call Tuscany, lived a civilization that would profoundly shape the earliest centuries of Roman history, the Etruscans. The Etruscans remain one of the great mysteries of the ancient world. They spoke a language that is still only partially understood, one that appears to be unrelated to any other known language family. Their origins were debated even in antiquity. The Greek historian Herodotus believed they had migrated from Lydia in western Anatolia. The Greek geographer Dionysius of Halicarnassus disagreed, arguing they were an indigenous Italian people. Modern genetic studies have actually provided some clarity here, suggesting the Etruscans were primarily a local population with some genetic input from Anatolia, likely from the Neolithic farming migrations thousands of years earlier rather than any Bronze Age colonization. What we know about them comes primarily from their tombs, which are extraordinarily well preserved and richly decorated. The Etruscans were sophisticated, urban, commercially active, and artistically accomplished. They built proper cities, traded widely across the Mediterranean, were skilled metalworkers and engineers, and had a complex religious system involving elaborate divination practices. They read the future in the entrails of sacrificed animals and in the flight patterns of birds, practices that the Romans absorbed almost entirely. In the centuries before Rome's rise, Etruria was the dominant cultural and political force in central and northern Italy. Etruscan kings, called Lucumones, ruled over a loose confederation of 12 major cities. These cities controlled trade routes, exploited mineral resources, and extended their influence southward into the region around Rome itself. And this brings us to one of the most contentious questions in early Roman history. How Etruscan was early Rome? The Roman tradition insisted that Rome was founded by Latins, not Etruscans. The legendary founding story, which we will get to shortly, features Latin heroes and makes no mention of Etruscan origins. But archaeological evidence tells a more complicated story. The site of Rome in the 8th and 7th centuries before the Common Era shows strong Etruscan cultural influence, and several of Rome's early kings, according to Roman tradition itself, had Etruscan names or Etruscan connections. The city's earliest public buildings, including the first version of the Capitoline Temple, the Cloaca Maxima drainage system, and the design of the Forum, all show Etruscan architectural traditions. The Romans adopted Etruscan religious practices, Etruscan ceremonial dress, including the toga, the use of the fasces as a symbol of authority, gladiatorial combat in its earliest form, and even the alphabet. That alphabet came originally from the Greeks, but reached Rome via the Etruscans, filtered through their writing system. So when Romans wrote Latin in their own alphabet, they were using letters shaped by Etruscan hands. But before we get to what archaeology reveals, we have to reckon with what Rome believed about itself. And what Rome believed is one of the great foundation myths in human history. It begins not in Italy at all, but in the ruins of Troy. According to Roman legend, when the Greeks sacked Troy after 10 years of war, a Trojan prince named Aeneas escaped the burning city carrying his elderly father Anchises on his back and leading his young son Ascanius by the hand. The story is told most completely in Virgil's Aeneid, written in the 1st century before the Common Era, but the basic tradition is much older. Aeneas, who was the son of the goddess Venus and the mortal Anchises, was destined by the gods to found a new nation greater than Troy. He wandered the Mediterranean for years, had a tragic love affair with the queen of Carthage, Dido, who killed herself when he abandoned her to fulfill his destiny, a detail that would carry uncomfortable resonance centuries later when Rome and Carthage went to war. Eventually, Aeneas reached Italy, fought and won a war against the local Latin tribes, and founded the city of Lavinium. His son Ascanius founded the city of Alba Longa, and it was from Alba Longa's royal dynasty that the founders of Rome would eventually come. That founding happened, according to Roman tradition, in 753 before the Common Era. The city was established by twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, grandsons of the rightful king of Alba Longa, Numitor, who had been overthrown by his treacherous brother Amulius. Amulius forced Numitor's daughter Rhea Silvia to become a Vestal virgin to prevent her from producing rival heirs. But the god Mars fell in love with Rhea Silvia and fathered twin sons on her. When Amulius discovered the twins, he ordered them drowned in the Tiber. But the servant given this task instead placed them in a basket and set them adrift on the river. The basket came to rest at the foot of the Palatine Hill, and there a she-wolf found the infants and suckled them. A woodpecker, also sacred to Mars, brought them food. Eventually, a herdsman named Faustulus found the boys and raised them with his wife Acca Larentia. When Romulus and Remus grew to manhood, they discovered their true origins, killed the usurper Amulius, restored their grandfather Numitor to his throne, and set out to found their own city near the place where they had been rescued. This is where the story turns dark. The brothers quarreled over which hilltop the new city would be built on, and which of them would give it his name. They agreed to settle the question by taking auguries from birds, watching the sky for signs from the gods. Remus stood on the Aventine Hill, and saw 6 vultures flying overhead. Romulus stood on the Palatine Hill and saw 12. Romulus claimed victory, began marking out the sacred boundaries of his new city, and Remus mocked him by jumping over the low walls. Romulus, in rage, killed his own brother. According to one version of the story, he did it himself. According to another, one of his supporters did it while Romulus looked away. Either way, Rome was born in fratricide, and that violent, blood-soaked origin was something Romans never entirely escaped. The city built on a brother's blood would spend much of its later history tearing itself apart in civil wars between men who were, at least in a civic sense, brothers. How much truth is there in any of this? Almost none at the literal level, but the story is historically revealing in ways that repay attention. The founding date of 753 actually corresponds reasonably well with the archaeological evidence for significant activity on the Palatine Hill. The detail of Romulus and Remus being suckled by a wolf connects to a Latin word, lupa, which means both she-wolf and prostitute, leading some scholars to suggest the story originally had the boys raised by a woman of low status, and that the wolf came later as a more dignified mythological substitution. The Trojan connection was almost certainly invented, or at least elaborated to give Rome noble, ancient origins in a world where Greeks dominated cultural prestige and connected everything significant to their own mythological tradition. And the violence at Rome's foundation, the killing of Remus, the rape of the Sabine women to provide wives for Romulus and his followers, reflects something real about the brutal, martial character that Rome always valued in itself. What archaeology actually shows is that the Palatine Hill was inhabited in the 10th century before the Common Era, that settlement gradually expanded to other hills in the following centuries, that the marshy valley between the hills was drained and began to be used as a communal meeting space, the future Forum Romanum, around 625 to 600 before the Common Era, and that by 600, a genuine urban center was taking shape. The emergence of the Forum, with its paved surfaces, public buildings, and drainage infrastructure, represents the real birth of Rome as a city rather than a collection of village settlements. And this urban transformation shows very strong Etruscan fingerprints. Roman tradition preserved a list of 7 kings who ruled Rome from its founding until the Republic began in 509 before the Common Era. The last 3 of these kings, Tarquinius Priscus, Servius Tullius, and Tarquinius Superbus, are widely believed to reflect an actual period of Etruscan dominance over Rome. Tarquinius Priscus, the 5th king, came to Rome from the Etruscan city of Tarquinii, built the Circus Maximus for chariot racing, began construction of the Great Temple on the Capitoline Hill, and expanded the city significantly. Servius Tullius, whatever his origins, reorganized Roman society into the census-based classes that would shape Roman politics for centuries. And Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, the last king, was by all Roman accounts a tyrant so brutal and arrogant that his overthrow became the founding moment of Roman liberty. The story of how the monarchy ended is told with the kind of dramatic intensity that suggests it was retold countless times, shaped by generations of storytelling into something more myth than history, yet perhaps not entirely divorced from real events. The crucial incident involved the king's son, Sextus Tarquinius, who raped a noblewoman named Lucretia. Lucretia, a woman praised throughout Roman tradition for her virtue and chastity, told her father and husband what had happened, made them swear revenge, and then killed herself with a dagger rather than live with dishonor. Her kinsman, Lucius Junius Brutus, a man who had survived at the royal court by pretending to be a fool, a disguise suggested by his name Brutus, meaning dull or stupid, used the outrage over Lucretia's death to whip up a revolution. The king and his sons were expelled. Rome would never again be ruled by a king. This happened, Roman tradition said, in 509 before the Common Era, the year Romans counted as the first year of the Republic. The historicity of the exact event is uncertain, but the archaeological and literary evidence does support a significant political rupture around this period, with the end of Etruscan-style monarchy and the beginning of a more oligarchic form of government. What is fascinating is how deeply the Romans clung to this story and what it meant to them. For the rest of their history, the word king, rex in Latin, was one of the most toxic words in Roman political vocabulary. Even Julius Caesar, who for all practical purposes wielded royal power, refused the title of king with theatrical vehemence. The shadow of Tarquin fell across every ambitious Roman leader for 500 years. The republic that replaced the monarchy was an extraordinarily complex system of government, one that reflected the Romans' deep suspicion of concentrated power and their equally deep commitment to aristocratic privilege. At its core was a simple principle: no one man should hold supreme authority alone, and no one should hold it for long. The highest office in the republic was the consulship. Each year, the Roman people elected 2 consuls who served for exactly 1 year and held equal power. Either consul could veto the other's decisions with a single word: veto, meaning I forbid. This mutual check was the fundamental mechanism of republican government. Below the consuls were a series of other magistracies arranged in a hierarchy. Praetors served as judicial officials and military commanders. Quaestors handled financial administration. Aediles maintained public buildings and organized games. And above them all, in times of genuine crisis, the Senate could authorize the appointment of a dictator, a single individual who held supreme power for a maximum of 6 months. The dictator was meant to be an emergency measure, used and then surrendered. Cincinnatus, the legendary farmer dictator who saved Rome from the Aequi in 458 before the Common Era and then returned to his plow, was held up as the ideal. A man who exercised absolute power with complete virtue and then voluntarily gave it back. The Romans would spend the last century of the Republic waiting in vain for a Cincinnatus and getting a series of Caesars instead. The Senate was the most powerful institution in the Republic, though it technically had no formal legislative authority. It was an advisory body composed of former magistrates, which meant it was dominated by Rome's oldest and most powerful families. The Senate controlled the state's finances, directed foreign policy, assigned military commands, and could declare states of emergency. Senatorial decisions were not technically law, but in practice, flouting them was political suicide. The Senate was where real power lived, and throughout the Middle Republic it governed Rome with considerable effectiveness. But the Senate was also the instrument of a specific class, the patricians. Patrician families, those who claimed descent from the original senators appointed by Romulus, held a near monopoly on political, religious, and social power in early Rome. They alone could be senators. They alone could hold the highest magistracies. They alone could serve as priests and conduct the rituals on which Rome's relationship with the gods depended. And this exclusivity created one of the defining conflicts of the early Republic, the struggle of the orders. The plebeians, everyone who was not patrician, which meant the vast majority of Rome's population, including many wealthy and prominent families, were effectively second-class citizens in their own city. They could vote in the assemblies, but were excluded from real power. They were subject to laws they had no hand in making, and to judgments made by patrician magistrates according to rules that were not even written down, meaning the patricians could apply them as they chose. Beginning in the early 5th century before the Common Era, the plebeians began a sustained and remarkably effective campaign to change this. Their most powerful weapon was a form of collective action called the secession. Several times the plebeians simply left Rome en masse, threatening to establish a new city elsewhere and leaving the patricians with no one to fight their wars, work their land, or man their trade ships. This leverage was extraordinary. The first secession, according to tradition in 494 before the Common Era, produced the institution of the tribunes of the plebs. Tribunes were elected by the plebeians as their official representatives and given the power of sacrosanctity, meaning their persons were legally inviolable. Anyone who harmed a tribune could be killed on the spot without legal consequence. More importantly, tribunes had the power to interpose their persons between a magistrate and a citizen, physically blocking any official action. This was the tribunician veto, and it was one of the most powerful political tools in the Roman system. The struggle continued for nearly 2 centuries. In 450 before the Common Era came one of the most important developments in Roman legal history: the codification of Roman law in the 12 Tables. Before this, Roman law was unwritten, known only to patrician priests and magistrates who could interpret it as they pleased. The 12 Tables changed this by inscribing the law on 12 bronze tablets and displaying them publicly in the Forum for all to read. The law they contained was often harsh by modern standards, reflecting a society organized around property, patriarchal authority, and rigid social hierarchy. A father had the power of life and death over his children. Debtors could be sold into slavery or killed by their creditors. Marriages between patricians and plebeians were forbidden. But the very act of writing the law down was revolutionary. Law became a public thing, a shared resource, something citizens could read and cite and argue over. The 12 Tables were the foundation on which all later Roman law was built, and through Roman law, on much of Western legal tradition. The struggle of the orders wound down in 287 before the Common Era with the Lex Hortensia, which made decisions of the plebeian assembly binding on all Romans, including patricians. By this point, the distinction between patrician and plebeian had become less sharp in practice anyway, as wealthy plebeian families had gradually gained access to most magistracies and many had intermarried with patrician families. What emerged was a new Roman ruling class, the nobilitas, composed of families whose ancestors had held the consulship, whether patrician or plebeian in origin. Aristocracy had expanded slightly but remained firmly entrenched. While the Romans were working out their internal political arrangements, they were also fighting continuously for survival and expansion. The early republic faced threats from all directions. The Etruscans to the north remained a significant military power. The hill tribes of the Apennines, particularly the Aequi and the Volsci, raided Roman territory regularly. And in 390 before the Common Era, a catastrophe struck that Rome never entirely forgot. A Gallic warband, led by a chieftain named Brennus, swept down from the Po Valley, destroyed a Roman army at the Battle of the Allia River, and sacked Rome itself. According to the famous story, when Brennus demanded gold as the price for leaving, and the Romans protested that the scales being used to weigh the gold were rigged, he threw his sword onto the scales and sneered, "Vae victis," woe to the conquered. The story may be embellished, but the sack itself almost certainly happened. It left a deep scar on Roman collective memory and produced a permanent Roman obsession with military preparedness and aggressive expansion as the only true security. After the Gallic sack, Rome rebuilt with new walls, the Servian Wall, whose remains can still be seen in Rome today, and resumed its methodical expansion across Italy. What makes Rome's Italian conquests remarkable is not just their ultimate success, but the method by which they were achieved. Rome was not merely a conquering power, it was a state-building machine. Defeated enemies were typically not enslaved or exterminated. Instead, they were incorporated into an expanding Roman network of alliances and citizenship grades. Some communities received full Roman citizenship. Others received Latin rights, a halfway status with most of the legal benefits of citizenship but not the vote. Others became allies, foederati, who kept their own local governments but were obligated to supply troops to Roman armies. This system meant that Rome's military strength grew with every conquest. By the time Rome reached the borders of Italy, the Roman army was not just Romans but the entire Italian peninsula fighting under Roman command. The great test of this system came in the wars against the Samnites, the fierce hill peoples of central and southern Italy who fought 3 major wars against Rome between 343 and 290 before the Common Era. The Samnites were formidable opponents who inflicted one of Rome's most humiliating defeats in the entire Republican period. In 321 before the Common Era, at the Battle of the Caudine Forks, a Roman army of 20,000 men was lured into a narrow mountain valley and surrounded by Samnite forces. The Romans were completely trapped. They could not fight their way out. After days of standoff, the Roman commanders negotiated a surrender. The entire Roman army was forced to lay down its weapons and pass under a yoke of spears, the most humiliating ritual of submission in the ancient world, a symbol that they had been reduced to the status of livestock. Rome eventually repudiated this agreement and returned to war, but the memory of the Caudine Forks burned for generations. The Third Samnite War ended in 290 before the Common Era with Roman victory, and by that point Rome controlled most of the Italian peninsula. What remained was the far south, the Greek cities of Magna Graecia, many of which called for help from across the Adriatic. King Pyrrhus of Epirus, one of the most brilliant generals of the Hellenistic age, who crossed to Italy with a professional army including 20 war elephants. Pyrrhus won 2 battles against Roman armies, at Heraclea in 280 and at Esculum in 279, but both victories came at catastrophic cost to his own forces. When his advisors congratulated him on the second victory, he is said to have replied that another such victory and he would be ruined, giving us the phrase, Pyrrhic victory. He eventually abandoned Italy, and the Romans went on to conquer the south. But the encounter with Pyrrhus had introduced Rome to Hellenistic military professionalism and begun a fateful entanglement with the Greek world. It also brought Rome to the attention of Carthage, the great Phoenician mercantile city on the coast of what is now Tunisia, which for generations had been the dominant power in the western Mediterranean. Carthage and Rome made alliances against Pyrrhus, but once Pyrrhus was gone, they found themselves facing each other with no buffer between them. The trigger for conflict was Sicily. Control of Sicily meant control of Mediterranean trade, and both powers coveted it. In 264 before the Common Era, the First Punic War began. It would last 23 years. The word Punic comes from the Latin punicus, which derives from Phoenicus, meaning Phoenician. Carthage, Rome's great rival, was a Phoenician foundation, established by settlers from the city of Tyre in what is now Lebanon. By the 3rd century before the Common Era, Carthage had grown into an empire with territories across North Africa, southern Spain, Sardinia, and western Sicily. Its wealth came from trade, and its military power rested on a professional mercenary army and the finest navy in the western Mediterranean. Rome, which had never been a significant naval power, initially seemed completely outmatched at sea. What happened next is one of the most remarkable stories of institutional ingenuity in military history. When a Carthaginian warship was wrecked on the Italian coast in the opening phase of the war, the Romans dragged it ashore, studied it intensively, and built a fleet of 120 identical vessels in 60 days. But they recognized that even with ships, they could not match Carthaginian seamanship. So they invented a device called the corvus, a rotating boarding bridge with a spike on the end that could be dropped onto an enemy ship, locking the 2 vessels together and turning a sea battle into a land battle where Roman soldiers excelled. At the Battle of Mylae in 260 before the Common Era, this technology gave Rome its first major naval victory. The Romans lost battles at sea, sometimes catastrophically, but they kept rebuilding their fleet and kept fighting. Their persistence was itself a military weapon. The First Punic War ended in 241 with a Roman victory, with Carthage ceding Sicily and paying a massive war indemnity. Rome had become a Mediterranean power, but the peace did not hold. Carthage, humiliated and financially strained, watched Rome annex Sardinia in 238 inches, a move of brazen opportunism, while Carthage was distracted by a mercenary revolt. The Carthaginian general Hamilcar Barca, who had fought brilliantly in Sicily, now turned his attention to Spain. Hamilcar and then his son-in-law Hasdrubal built a Carthaginian empire in the Iberian Peninsula that gave Carthage the resources and manpower to consider a rematch. And when Hamilcar's son, a young man named Hannibal, took command in Spain, the rematch became inevitable. Hannibal Barca is one of the most extraordinary military commanders in human history, and his campaign against Rome is one of the most breathtaking stories of strategic audacity ever told. In 218 before the Common Era, Hannibal set out from Spain with an army of about 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. He crossed the Pyrenees, then the Alps, in late autumn, a crossing considered virtually impossible, losing perhaps half his army to cold, falls, and tribal attacks. He descended into the Po Valley of northern Italy and within a few months had won 2 crushing victories against Roman armies at the Trebia River and Lake Trasimene. Then, in 216, before the Common Era, at the Battle of Cannae in southern Italy, he accomplished something that military theorists still study. Cannae was the most devastating defeat in Roman history. Hannibal commanded roughly 50,000 men against a Roman army of at least 70,000, perhaps 86,000, according to some ancient sources, the largest army Rome had ever put into the field. Roman commanders Varro and Paulus massed their infantry in a deep central formation designed to simply overwhelm Hannibal's center. What Hannibal did was allow his center to give way under Roman pressure, while his wings, composed of superior cavalry and veteran African infantry, wheeled inward. The Roman army, pushing forward, found itself enclosed in a pocket from which there was no escape. The slaughter was methodical and total. Between 50 and 70,000 Romans died in a single afternoon. The consul Paulus was killed. Of the Roman army that marched to Cannae that morning, only a few thousand survived. Hannibal swept up the Roman dead's gold rings by the bushel. And then, to the bewilderment of his own officers, Hannibal did not march on Rome. His cavalry commander Maharbal reportedly said to him, "Hannibal, you know how to win a victory, but not how to use one." This moment has been debated ever since. Hannibal may have calculated that he could not besiege Rome without siege equipment. He may have believed that Rome's Italian allies would now defect to him, depriving Rome of the manpower it needed to continue. He may have thought that peace negotiation was possible and preferable. Whatever the reason, he did not go to Rome. He spent 16 years in Italy, winning battles but never landing a decisive blow on the city itself. While Rome rebuilt, raised new armies, and methodically turned the strategic situation against him. The man who figured out how to defeat Hannibal without fighting him directly was Quintus Fabius Maximus, appointed dictator after the disaster at Lake Trasimene. Fabius understood that Rome could not match Hannibal in open battle, so he refused to fight in open battle. He shadowed Hannibal's army through the mountains, cutting off foraging parties, harassing supply lines, and avoiding pitched battle. His strategy worked in strategic terms even though it was politically disastrous, earning him the nickname Cunctator, the delayer, which was meant as an insult. Romans found watching their land ravaged by Hannibal, while Fabius lurked in the hills, deeply humiliating. The political pressure to fight produced Cannae. But after Cannae, with most of Rome's generals dead and the scale of the disaster undeniable, the Romans embraced something like the Fabian approach, while also developing another strategy. Rather than try to defeat Hannibal in Italy, they would attack Carthage's other assets, particularly Spain. The commander they sent to Spain was a young man of extraordinary ability, whose father and uncle had both been killed by Carthaginian forces in Iberia, Publius Cornelius Scipio, who would become known to history as Scipio Africanus. Scipio was in his mid-20s when he took command in Spain, young enough that the Senate debated whether he was even legally eligible for such a command. But he had fought at Cannae and survived, and he had spent the years since studying Hannibal's methods with the intensity of someone who intended not just to fight Hannibal, but to beat him at his own game. He captured the main Carthaginian base at Cartagena with a daring amphibious assault, then systematically dismantled Carthaginian power in Spain in a series of battles that showed a tactical creativity and personal daring that were deeply Hannibalic. By 206 before the Common Era, Carthage had been expelled from the Iberian Peninsula. Scipio then persuaded the Senate to let him take the war to Africa itself. In 204, he landed in North Africa with an army and began ravaging Carthaginian territory. Carthage, now genuinely threatened, recalled Hannibal from Italy. The two greatest commanders of their generation met at the Battle of Zama in 202 before the Common Era. This time Scipio had the cavalry superiority. His Numidian cavalry, led by the Prince Massinissa who had switched sides from Carthage to Rome, routed Hannibal's cavalry and returned to strike the Carthaginian rear while Scipio's infantry held the front. Hannibal suffered his first decisive defeat. Carthage sued for peace. The Second Punic War was over, and Rome had survived the greatest threat it had ever faced. But the Punic Wars did something to Rome beyond establishing its Mediterranean dominance. They transformed Roman society in ways that would eventually destabilize the Republic itself. The wars required enormous resources and produced enormous wealth. The conquest of Spain, then Greece, then large parts of the Near East, brought hundreds of thousands of slaves to Italy and Sicily. Roman senators and wealthy equestrians, the second tier of the Roman elite, invested the profits of conquest in vast slave-worked agricultural estates called latifundia. Small farmers who had served in Rome's armies for years and returned to find their lands neglected or bought up by wealthy neighbors could not compete. They drifted to the cities, particularly Rome, forming an urban proletariat dependent on grain distributions and cheap entertainment for survival. The social fabric that had produced the disciplined farmer soldiers who beat Hannibal was fraying badly. Conquest brought other changes too. Rome's encounter with the Hellenistic world, with the sophisticated Greek culture that had spread across the eastern Mediterranean following Alexander the Great's conquests, produced a cultural revolution in Rome. Educated Romans began learning Greek, reading Greek philosophy and literature, importing Greek art, and gradually absorbing Greek intellectual traditions. The elder Cato, a conservative senator and censor who is one of the most vivid personalities in the Middle Republic, complained bitterly about this Greek cultural infiltration, declaring that physicians and philosophers alike were corrupting Roman morals with their fancy foreign ideas. He lost the argument. Greek culture permeated the Roman elite, and while a distinctly Roman voice remained, it was increasingly speaking through Hellenistic forms. Greece itself was absorbed into the Roman system in a complex and at times brutal process. Rome had intervened in Greek affairs repeatedly, nominally as a liberator and protector against Macedonian power. But Roman liberation always came with strings attached, and when the Greek cities proved ungrateful or resistant, Rome showed a harder face. In 146 before the Common Era, the same year that Rome razed Carthage to the ground after the Third Punic War, the Roman general Mummius sacked Corinth, one of the wealthiest and most beautiful cities in Greece, killing its men and selling its women and children into slavery. The timing was not coincidental. Rome was sending a message to the entire Mediterranean world about the cost of resistance. The message was received. By the middle of the 2nd century before the Common Era, Rome had created an empire that stretched from Spain to western Anatolia, from the Rhine Valley to North Africa. This was an empire of unprecedented size, and no coherent administrative system to manage it. The provinces were governed by former magistrates, proconsuls, and propraetors, who served one-year terms and had enormous latitude in how they exploited their territories. The opportunities for personal enrichment were staggering, and the temptations were almost irresistible. Roman governors and their staffs systematically extracted wealth from the provinces through taxation, extortion, and outright theft. Some were prosecuted on return to Rome, but the courts were staffed by senators who were reluctant to convict their own kind, and successful provincial predators returned to Rome wealthy enough to invest in political careers and silence critics. The wealth flooding into Rome from the provinces accelerated the social crisis that the Punic Wars had begun. The gap between the rich and the poor grew to a chasm. The city of Rome itself had grown to perhaps 500,000 people, a congested, smoky, noisy, dangerous megalopolis where the wealthy lived in spacious townhouses on the hills, and the poor packed into multi-story apartment buildings called insulae that regularly caught fire or collapsed. Slavery was so pervasive that perhaps a third of the Italian population in the 2nd century before the Common Era was enslaved. Slave gangs worked the mines of Spain and the farms of Sicily under conditions of such brutality that slave revolts periodically erupted with terrifying violence. The political system was clearly failing to address any of this. The Senate, dominated by wealthy families who had profited enormously from conquest and provincial exploitation, had no institutional interest in fundamental reform. The assemblies of the Roman people, theoretically the sovereign body, were in practice dominated by the wealthy because of the way voting was organized, with the richest voting units casting their votes first, and the voting ending when a majority was reached, meaning the poor often never voted at all. 2 young men from one of Rome's most prestigious families decided to challenge this system and paid with their lives. Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus was elected tribune of the plebs in 133 before the Common Era. He was the grandson of Scipio Africanus on his mother's side and came from about as blue-blooded a Roman background as existed. But he had seen the devastation of the Italian countryside, the empty farms, and the growing desperation of the rural poor, and he proposed a law that was in theory entirely conventional, enforcing an ancient statute called the Licinian Sextian Laws that set a limit of 500 iugera, about 300 acres, on the amount of Rome's public land, ager publicus, that any individual could occupy. In practice, Wealthy families had been ignoring this limit for generations and had come to think of these public lands as their own private property. Tiberius's proposal would have reclaimed the excess and distributed it to landless citizens. The Senate was outraged. When Tiberius tried to present his bill to the assembly, a fellow tribune named Octavius vetoed it. Tiberius did something constitutionally unprecedented. He had the assembly vote to remove Octavius from office, arguing that a tribune who blocked the will of the people had betrayed his fundamental function. The bill passed, the Land Commission was established, and the Senate responded by refusing to fund the commission's work. When a friendly king of Pergamon died and left his kingdom to Rome, Tiberius proposed using the inheritance to fund the land distribution, cutting the Senate out entirely. The Senate was alarmed not just at the land reform, but at what Tiberius was doing constitutionally. He was using popular power to bypass senatorial authority, and he was running for an unprecedented second tribunate to see his program through. This broke all norms. On election day in 133, a mob of senators and their followers, led by the Pontifex Maximus Scipio Nasica, attacked Tiberius and his supporters in the Forum. Tiberius Gracchus was beaten to death with furniture and thrown into the Tiber. The Senate had committed political murder for the first time in the Republic's history, and they had gotten away with it. 10 years later, Tiberius's younger brother, Gaius Gracchus, elected tribune in 123, before the Common Era, attempted an even more ambitious reform program, including extending citizenship to Latin allies and cheapening the grain supply for the urban poor. He was a better politician than his brother, a more forceful speaker, and a more sophisticated legislative strategist. But the Senate outmaneuvered him, and in 121, the Senate passed what would become a notorious precedent, the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the ultimate decree of the Senate, instructing the consul to take whatever measures were necessary to protect the state. Gaius's supporters were massacred, and Gaius himself, surrounded and seeing no escape, had a slave kill him. 3,000 of his followers were subsequently rounded up and executed without trial. 2 dead Gracchi, thousands of murdered supporters, and nothing actually changed. The problems that had motivated the Gracchi remained and deepened. And the violence the Senate had used to suppress reform had demonstrated that force worked, that killing political opponents was an option. Rome's political culture had been permanently altered. The question was no longer whether violence would be used in politics, but who would use it most effectively. The answer began to emerge through military reform. In 107 before the Common Era, a consul named Gaius Marius, a self-made man from a non-noble family who had risen through sheer military talent and political cunning, was facing a crisis in North Africa, where a war against the Numidian king Jugurtha was going badly. Marius could not recruit enough men through the traditional property-based levy, so he did something radical. He opened the legions to men without property, the proletarii, equipping them at state expense. This Marian reform created a professional army, but it had a profound and perhaps unintended consequence. Soldiers recruited this way were loyal first to their general, who promised them land and loot, and only secondarily to the Roman state. Marius was popular enough and skillful enough that this was not immediately a problem. He solved the Jugurthine War, then saved Rome from 2 massive invasions by Germanic tribes, the Cimbri and the Teutoni, winning 5 successive consulships in a period when holding the office twice in a lifetime was considered exceptional. He was hailed as the 3rd founder of Rome. But Marius had created a template. Military men with loyal personal armies had a political tool that no magistrate or senator could match. The next to wield it was a patrician aristocrat of ancient lineage and elegant education who had served under Marius but came to despise him, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Sulla was consul in 88 before the Common Era when the Senate assigned him the lucrative command against Mithridates, the king of Pontus in northern Anatolia, who had launched a massive anti-Roman revolt and orchestrated the massacre of perhaps 80,000 Roman and Italian residents in the Greek East in a single day. This was a major military command with major opportunities for wealth, and Marius wanted it. Through political maneuvering, the popular assembly transferred the command from Sulla to Marius. Sulla's response was unprecedented. He marched his army on Rome. 6 legions of Roman soldiers, sworn to defend the Republic, invaded the capital itself and drove Marius into exile. Sulla reorganized the constitution in favor of the Senate and then left for the east to fight Mithridates. While Sulla was away, Marius returned with an army of his own, seized Rome, and conducted a purge of his enemies with horrifying thoroughness. Marius was elected consul for an unprecedented 7th time, then died a few days into his term. His supporters, led by Cinna, held Rome until Sulla returned victorious from the east in 83 before the Common Era. Another civil war, another siege of Rome, another purge. But Sulla's purge was more systematic and more lethal than anything that had come before. He instituted a practice called proscription. Lists of enemies were posted publicly, and anyone whose name appeared on a list was an outlaw who could be killed on sight by anyone. With the killer receiving a reward and the victim's property going to the state, it was murder industrialized, murder with legal cover. Thousands died. Sulla had himself appointed dictator without the traditional 6-month time limit and used his power to reform the constitution in a thoroughly conservative direction, strengthening the Senate, weakening the tribunate, and attempting to close off the pathways by which ambitious demagogues could reach military power. Then, in an act that shocked and baffled contemporaries and has puzzled historians ever since, he resigned. He retired to his country estate, where he wrote his memoirs, developed liver failure, and died in 78 before the Common Era. His abdication suggested that he was not interested in permanent personal power, that he genuinely believed he was restoring the Republic to health. But by marching on Rome twice, by demonstrating that military force was the ultimate argument in Roman politics, he had done more to destroy the Republic than any man before Julius Caesar. In the generation after Sulla, 3 men dominated Roman politics, each representing a different combination of the resources that mattered in late Republican Rome: wealth, military glory, and popular politics. Marcus Licinius Crassus was the richest man in Rome, perhaps the richest man in the ancient world, having made his fortune by buying property during Sulla's proscriptions at prices the sellers could not negotiate, since they were being murdered. Crassus owned silver mines, trained slaves as craftsmen, and sold their services, and operated a private fire brigade that would arrive at burning buildings and buy the property cheaply before putting out the flames. He used his wealth to fund political careers across the Roman spectrum, building a network of obligation that made him indispensable. Gnaeus Pompeius, Magnus, Pompey the Great, had military glory in astonishing abundance. He had fought brilliantly in the civil wars of Sulla's era, earned a triumph at age 25 by ruthlessly suppressing the Marian remnants in Africa, cleared the Mediterranean of pirates in a lightning 3-month campaign in 67 before the Common Era, and then conquered the entire eastern Mediterranean, reorganizing kingdoms, founding cities, and adding more territory and revenue to Roman control than anyone since the great days of Republican expansion. He was the most successful general of his generation and was treated by the Roman people with something approaching divine veneration. The third man was Gaius Julius Caesar. Caesar came from an old patrician family that was more distinguished in lineage than in recent achievement. His family claimed descent from the goddess Venus and the legendary hero Aeneas, making his pedigree impeccably ancient even if his family's recent political record was modest. Caesar was primarily known in his early career not as a military man, but as a political operator of genius, a spellbinding orator, a master of popular politics, a man of extraordinary personal charm and calculated generosity who spent money he did not have on games and spectacles and gifts to build political capital. He was also known for his personal flamboyance, his elegant dress, his well-documented series of love affairs with other men's wives, and his hair loss, which was a source of deep personal vanity. Caesar combed his thinning hair forward from the back of his head and considered the right to wear the laurel wreath on all public occasions one of the most valuable honors of his career. In 60 before the Common Era, Caesar engineered an informal alliance with Pompey and Crassus, what historians call the First Triumvirate, though the Romans of the time called it nothing of the sort. It was a private agreement. Crassus's money, Pompey's military prestige, and Caesar's political skill working together to dominate the Republic's decision-making. The arrangement worked superbly in the short term. Caesar got what he most wanted: an extended military command in Gaul, the region covering modern France, Belgium, and parts of Germany and Switzerland. The Gallic campaigns that followed were 9 years of almost continuous warfare, during which Caesar conquered the whole of Gaul, made 2 expeditions to Britain, crossed the Rhine into Germanic territory, defeated dozens of tribes and coalitions, killed or enslaved perhaps 1 million Gauls by ancient estimates, and accumulated the military glory and loyal personal army that would eventually allow him to master Rome itself. Caesar's account of these campaigns, the Gallic Wars, is still read today, and it is a masterpiece of self-promotion written in a stripped-down, almost journalistic Latin prose that was designed to be readable by any educated Roman and to make its author seem like a clear-eyed, reluctant conqueror performing a historical necessity. It is also a document that is honest enough about Roman violence that historians have sometimes used it as evidence against its own author. The greatest crisis of the Gallic campaigns came in 52 before the Common Era, when a young Arverni chieftain named Vercingetorix united most of the Gaulish tribes in a coordinated revolt against Roman rule. Vercingetorix was a remarkable commander who adopted a scorched earth strategy, denying Caesar's army food and supplies, and managed to force Caesar into some of the hardest fighting of his career. The climax came at the siege of Alesia, where Caesar simultaneously besieged Vercingetorix's force inside the fortified hilltop town while a massive relief army gathered outside. Caesar built a remarkable double ring of fortifications, an inner ring to contain Vercingetorix, and an outer ring to defend against the relief army. He was besieging and being besieged simultaneously. When the relief army attacked and Vercingetorix sortied from the town, Caesar's fortifications held, and then he personally led the critical counterattack that broke the relief force. Vercingetorix surrendered, was taken to Rome, displayed in Caesar's triumph years later, and then strangled in prison. Gaul was Roman. While Caesar was winning Gaul, the first triumvirate was collapsing. Crassus, determined to match his partner's military glory, launched an invasion of Parthia and led his army to destruction at the Battle of Carrhae in 53 before the Common Era, where he and most of his army were killed by Parthian cavalry and horse archers who simply refused to engage Roman infantry in close combat. With Crassus dead, the balance between Caesar and Pompey broke down. Pompey's wife Julia, Caesar's daughter who had been a genuine bond between them, had died in childbirth in 54. The 2 men who remained were too proud, too ambitious, and too powerful to share the stage. The Senate, dominated by conservative senators deeply alarmed by Caesar's power, pushed Pompey toward opposing Caesar. They insisted that Caesar must return to Rome as a private citizen, without his army or his provinces, making him vulnerable to prosecution by political enemies who had been waiting years for the opportunity. Caesar's position was straightforward. He would give up his command if Pompey did the same. The Senate refused. On the night of January 10, 49 before the Common Era, Caesar made his decision. He led 1 legion south to the Rubicon River, the small stream that marked the boundary between Caesar's province and Italy proper. Crossing it with troops was legally an act of war against the Roman state. Caesar is said to have hesitated on the bank, then looked at his men and said, "The die is cast." He crossed. What followed was a civil war whose speed was almost as astonishing as its scale. Pompey and most of the Senate fled Rome without fighting. Caesar moved through Italy so quickly and was so diplomatically skillful that city after city opened its gates. Pompey and the senatorial forces retreated to Greece, where Pompey's military prestige and eastern connections could be fully exploited. Caesar first secured Spain, defeating Pompeian forces there, then crossed to Greece. At the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 before the Common Era, despite being outnumbered, Caesar crushed Pompey's army. Pompey fled to Egypt, where he was murdered on the beach at Alexandria before Caesar arrived, killed by Egyptian agents who hoped to please the victor. Caesar arrived in Egypt to find Pompey's head presented to him as a gift. He is said to have wept. Whether the tears were genuine or diplomatic theater, Egypt posed an immediate political problem. The young Ptolemaic co-regents, the brother and sister Ptolemy XIII and Cleopatra VII, were at war with each other. Cleopatra, rolled up in a carpet or a sack according to the famous story, was smuggled into the palace to meet Caesar privately. She was 21 years old. He was 52. Whatever happened that night, Caesar ended up backing Cleopatra, defeating and killing Ptolemy XIII, and spending months in Egypt, while Rome waited for him, long enough that Cleopatra became pregnant with his son, whom she named Caesarion. Caesar returned to Rome, fought and won more campaigns in Africa and Spain against remaining Pompeian resistance, and celebrated 4 triumphs. He was appointed Dictator Perpetuo, Dictator in Perpetuity, an office without precedent or time limit. He began an enormous legislative program, reforming the calendar, founding colonies, planning the draining of the Pontine marshes, redesigning the Forum. He was also extraordinarily generous in his treatment of former enemies, pardoning most of the men who had fought against him, a policy called clementia that he calculated would be more politically valuable than vengeance. He was right about the long-term strategy, but fatally wrong about the immediate tactics. On the Ides of March, 44 before the Common Era, a group of senators, many of them men Caesar had personally pardoned, gathered around him in the theater of Pompeii, where the Senate was meeting while the Curia was under renovation, and stabbed him 23 times. The conspirators, who called themselves the Liberators, were led by Gaius Cassius Longinus and Marcus Junius Brutus, whose ancestor Lucius Junius Brutus had expelled the Tarquins 5 centuries earlier. Brutus was a man of genuine philosophical conviction who had opposed Caesar reluctantly, and who genuinely believed he was performing a patriotic act of tyrannicide in the tradition of the Republic's founding. Caesar had reportedly seen Brutus among the attackers, and said, his final words in Shakespeare's version, et tu Brute, though the historical account in Suetonius says he pulled his toga over his face and said nothing, dying at the foot of a statue of Pompey in a puddle of his own blood. The assassination achieved none of its intended aims. The conspirators had assumed that killing Caesar would restore the Republic. What they had not planned for was the possibility that Romans had moved beyond wanting the Republic, that 20 years of civil war, proscription, and power politics had produced a population that wanted stability, bread, and security more than it wanted constitutional forms. Caesar's lieutenant Mark Antony, who had survived because Brutus overruled those who wanted to kill him too, gave a funeral speech for Caesar in the Forum that inflamed popular rage against the liberators. Caesar's will was read publicly, revealing that he had left each Roman citizen 300 sesterces and his gardens across the Tiber as a public park. The crowd went berserk. The liberators fled Rome. Their brief moment of triumph dissolved into exactly the kind of chaos they had claimed to be preventing. What emerged from this chaos was the Second Triumvirate: Mark Antony, Caesar's adopted son, and heir Gaius Octavius, who renamed himself Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, and the cavalry commander Marcus Lepidus. Unlike the informal arrangement of the First Triumvirate, the second was a legally constituted body with official powers. It immediately demonstrated its character by drawing up proscription lists. Among the first names on the list was Cicero, Rome's greatest orator and the voice of republican government. Cicero had written blistering speeches attacking Antony, the Philippics, and Antony wanted him dead. Cicero tried to flee by sea but was caught. He offered his neck to the soldiers and was beheaded. His head and hands were sent back to Rome and nailed to the speaker's platform in the Forum, the same platform from which he had delivered some of the greatest speeches in Latin history. Antony's wife Fulvia reportedly took a hairpin and jabbed it repeatedly into the tongue that had attacked her husband. The triumvirs crushed the liberators at the Battle of Philippi in 42 before the Common Era. Both Brutus and Cassius committed suicide after the defeat. The Roman world was divided between Antony, who took the eastern provinces, and Octavian, who took the west. Lepidus got Africa, but was gradually marginalized. The arrangement was cemented by Antony's marriage to Octavian's sister Octavia, but Antony spent most of his time in the east, drawn increasingly into the orbit of Cleopatra VII of Egypt, with whom he began an affair, then a formal political and romantic partnership. The relationship between Antony and Cleopatra was one of the most consequential love affairs in history. Though calling it simply a love affair is an oversimplification, Cleopatra was not merely a beautiful woman. She was a brilliant political operator, the only Ptolemaic ruler in the dynasty's nearly 300-year history to bother learning Egyptian, as well as speaking at least 7 other languages. She understood that in the chaos of the late Roman civil wars, aligning Egypt with the winning faction was a matter of survival, and she was betting heavily on Antony. Antony, in turn, saw in Cleopatra's wealth and Egypt's resources the means to fund an Eastern empire that might make him more powerful than Octavian. Octavian, back in Rome, was building his own political base with methodical care. He understood something Antony apparently did not: that the key to Roman political legitimacy was not Eastern kingship or divine partnership, but traditional Roman values, austerity, piety, and the restoration of republican norms, at least the appearance of them. He cultivated an image of modest, traditional virtue while systematically eliminating rivals and consolidating power. He was extraordinarily cold-blooded in his political calculations, nowhere more visibly than in his personal life, where he divorced wives and took new ones as political circumstances required, with a detachment that was almost inhuman. The final confrontation came at the Battle of Actium in 31 before the Common Era, a naval engagement off the coast of western Greece. Antony and Cleopatra had assembled a massive fleet and army, but their forces were demoralized by disease, desertion, and Octavian's blockade. The battle itself was something of an anticlimax. Cleopatra withdrew her ships, and Antony followed, abandoning his army, which then surrendered to Octavian. They retreated to Alexandria. Octavian followed. When Antony received a false report that Cleopatra had already killed herself, he fell on his own sword. He did not die immediately, and was carried, bleeding, to Cleopatra's mausoleum, where she pulled him up through a window since she refused to open the doors. He died in her arms. Cleopatra was taken prisoner by Octavian, who wanted to display her in his triumph. She killed herself rather than endure that humiliation, using a method of suicide the Romans found admirable in their own citizens, but found deeply impressive in an enemy. She faced death with complete composure. The method of her suicide has been debated endlessly. The asp, the Egyptian cobra, is the traditional account. The reality may have been poison hidden in a comb or a drug smuggled to her by a loyal servant. Whatever the method, she died on August 12, 30 before the Common Era, the last ruler of an independent Egypt. Egypt became a Roman province. Caesarion, her son with Julius Caesar, was hunted down and killed. He was 17 years old. Octavian, sole master of the Roman world at 32 years of age, now faced the question that had destroyed Julius Caesar. How do you exercise absolute power in a state with a 500-year tradition of republican government and a political class that had just murdered a man for claiming too much? His answer, developed over years with considerable intelligence and pragmatic flexibility, was to give the appearance of restoring the republic while retaining all actual power. In 27 before the Common Era, he made a theatrical gesture of returning power to the Senate and people, handing back his provinces and armies. The Senate, in gratitude or in relief, or because they had no choice, gave him back proconsular command of all provinces where armies were needed, which was most of them, the title princeps, meaning first citizen, and a new honorary name, Augustus, meaning the venerable or the majestic, with religious overtones that stopped just short of calling him a god. He was called the first man, not the king. It was the same power by a different name, and everyone involved understood this perfectly. The republic was over. The empire had begun. It just did not call itself that yet. Augustus ruled for 44 years, the longest reign of any Roman emperor, and his rule was so effective and so lasting in its consequences that the Romans spoke of an Augustan age long after he was gone. The peace his victory brought, the Pax Romana, was real and significant. After a century of civil war, Rome had stability. He reformed the military, creating a standing professional army with fixed terms of service and guaranteed retirement benefits, binding soldiers' loyalty firmly to the emperor who paid their pensions. He reformed the provinces, installing professional administrators and gradually reducing the worst abuses. He rebuilt Rome physically on a scale so ambitious that he is said to have claimed he found Rome brick and left it marble. The Forum of Augustus, the Temple of Mars the Avenger, the complete rebuilding of the Pantheon, the transformation of the Palatine Hill into an imperial residence, The physical city was remade in his image. He also conducted a major moral reform program, though this was less successful than his political restructuring. Augustus was genuinely disturbed by what he saw as the decline of traditional Roman values, the low birth rates among the Roman elite, the prevalence of adultery and divorce, the weakening of the religious and family structures that he believed had made Rome great. He passed legislation penalizing bachelorhood and rewarding large families. He restored 82 temples. He personally promoted the worship of the old Roman gods and revived festivals that had fallen into disuse, but his moral campaign was undermined almost immediately by the behavior of his own family. His daughter Julia, confined by her father to an increasingly narrow life while he imposed moral codes on others, compensated by conducting a series of love affairs so flagrant and so publicly known that they became a scandal, Augustus exiled her. Later, he exiled her daughter for the same reasons. The gap between Augustan propaganda and Augustan family reality was a gift to satirists. Augustus had no son of his own. His only child was Julia, and his succession plans were a grim sequence of promising young men dying before him. Men he had marked as heirs, and then watched succumb to illness or accident, with what he clearly found, an emotionally devastating regularity. His nephew Marcellus died young. His grandsons, Gaius and Lucius Caesar, whom he had adopted, died within 2 years of each other. Deeply suspicious of his stepson Tiberius, who was also his ablest general, Augustus finally settled on Tiberius as his heir, almost by default. When Augustus died in 14 of the Common Era, at the age of 75, Tiberius became Rome's second emperor. Tiberius was a deeply unhappy man. He was a brilliant soldier and a capable administrator who seems to have genuinely disliked the political theater of imperial rule. He retired to the island of Capri in 27 and effectively governed the empire by letter for the last decade of his reign, while a praetorian prefect named Sejanus gathered extraordinary power in Rome and ran what was essentially a reign of terror, using treason trials to eliminate real and imagined enemies. When Tiberius finally realized the extent of Sejanus's ambitions, he had Sejanus arrested and executed along with his family, including his children. When Tiberius died in 37, he was not mourned. The Romans were reportedly not sure whether to grieve or celebrate. What came next was so bizarre and so terrifying that it has fascinated historians, novelists, and psychologists ever since. Tiberius was succeeded by his great-nephew, Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, known to history by his childhood nickname, Caligula, meaning little boot. In his first months, Caligula seemed wonderfully sane and generous after the darkness of Tiberius's last years. He recalled political exiles, burned the treason files, gave generous gifts to the people and the legions. Then, either as a result of a serious illness or the effects of the extraordinary stress of sudden absolute power at age 24, or because the absolute lack of constraints on his behavior revealed a character that had previously been constrained by necessity, Caligula became something else entirely. The stories about Caligula are so extreme that ancient historians admitted they were repeating rumors and that the most scandalous tales might be exaggerations, but something clearly went very wrong. He began executing people on slight pretexts. He humiliated senators with elaborate public degradations, forcing them to perform demeaning tasks and then laughing at their compliance. He had a tendency to announce at dinner that he could have any of his guests killed on a whim and was delighted by their discomfort. He demanded divine honors while alive, which Roman emperors generally had the decorum to accept only after death. He reportedly made his horse Incitatus a consul, though this story is almost certainly an ancient joke or satirical exaggeration that was taken literally. He conducted military campaigns in the north of Gaul and on the English Channel coast that seemed to achieve nothing and perhaps were designed to achieve nothing. His sister Drusilla died and he had her deified, which was unprecedented for a woman in Roman history and struck contemporaries as evidence of emotional instability. Whether Caligula was genuinely mentally ill, whether he was conducting a deliberate experiment to demonstrate that senators would tolerate anything from an emperor who controlled the army, or whether the stories are simply the result of hostile sources exaggerating the behavior of a ruler they hated, the practical result was the same. In January 41, officers of the Praetorian Guard assassinated him in a palace corridor, killing his wife and young daughter too. The Senate briefly discussed restoring the Republic. While they debated, the Praetorian Guard, who had found an elderly man hiding behind a curtain in the palace in a panic, brought him out, declared him emperor, and thus settled the question. The man was Tiberius Claudius Drusus, uncle of Caligula, nephew of Tiberius, nephew of Augustus, by marriage, Claudius. Claudius was not the fool that his family had assumed. He had lived quietly through the reigns of 4 emperors precisely because he seemed unthreatening, limping, stuttering, apparently feeble-minded. In fact, he was a genuine scholar who had written histories of the Etruscans and the Carthaginians, corresponded with learned men across the empire, and had a keen interest in law and administration. As emperor, he proved unexpectedly capable. He invaded Britain in 43, adding the province his ancestor Julius Caesar had twice attempted to conquer. He expanded Roman citizenship more broadly than any predecessor. He reformed the imperial bureaucracy, creating a more professional administrative apparatus run by freedmen who owed their positions entirely to him. He was unusual among Roman emperors in actively listening to debate and argument, though his tendency to fall asleep during judicial proceedings was noted critically by contemporaries. His downfall was his marriages. His third wife, Messalina, conducted herself with such reckless promiscuity that she eventually went through a wedding ceremony with a lover while Claudius was away. Either because she had somehow miscalculated Claudius's reaction, or, as one historian has suggested, because she was staging a kind of coup attempt to replace him with her new husband. When Claudius found out, Messalina was killed by his advisors before he could change his mind and pardon her. His fourth wife, Agrippina the Younger, was his own niece, which required a special senatorial dispensation. Agrippina was one of the most capable and ruthless political operators in Roman history, with a clearer strategic mind than most emperors. She manipulated Claudius into adopting her son from a previous marriage as his heir, and then, when Claudius's own son, Britannicus, began to grow up and potentially threaten her son's position, either poisoned Claudius or arranged circumstances so suspicious that contemporaries assumed she had. Her son, renamed Nero Claudius Caesar upon adoption, became emperor in 54 at the age of 16. The opening years of Nero's reign were so good that later Romans called them the Quinquennium Neronis, the 5 good years. Governed effectively by the philosopher Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus, while the young emperor showed some genuine artistic talent and personal generosity. But as Nero matured, or perhaps as his mother's control over him was resisted and then broken, something different emerged. In 59, he had Agrippina murdered, having failed in an earlier attempt by sending her on a boat designed to collapse. She swam to shore, and Nero eventually sent assassins to finish the job. When they arrived, she reportedly bared her abdomen and told them to strike where Nero had come from. Whether true or not, the story captures the atmosphere of terror and theatrical excess that surrounded the later Julio-Claudian court. Nero divorced and then killed his wife Octavia to marry a woman named Poppaea Sabina, who was reportedly so beautiful that Nero had her embalmed and not cremated after her death, which was itself suspicious, since he had reportedly kicked her when she was pregnant, which caused her death. He then went through a marriage ceremony with a male freedman named Sporus, whom he had castrated, reportedly because Sporus resembled Poppaea. He kicked his wife to death, then married her double whom he had surgically altered. Even allowing for hostile sources, Nero's personal life was genuinely extreme. In 64 came the Great Fire of Rome, which burned for 6 days and destroyed large sections of the city. Ancient sources, with varying degrees of evidence, suggested Nero started it to clear space for his massive new palace complex, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House, whose grounds covered a significant portion of central Rome and included an artificial lake, extensive gardens, and an enormous gilded bronze statue of Nero himself. The accusation that Nero fiddled while Rome burned is chronologically impossible, since the fiddle did not exist, but the sentiment it captures reflects genuine Roman outrage. What is historically documented is that Nero blamed the fire on a small religious sect that had already attracted negative attention, the Christians. The subsequent persecution, in which Christians were crucified, burned alive, and thrown to animals in the arena, was the first systematic Roman persecution of Christians, though motivated by politics rather than theology. Nero's end came through military revolt. The governor of Gaul, Vindex, rose in rebellion in 68 and was soon joined by the governor of Spain, Galba. When the Praetorian Guard and then the Senate abandoned Nero, he fled and killed himself, reportedly saying, "What an artist the world is losing in me." He died at 30 years old. 4 emperors competed for power in the year that followed. Galba was murdered by the Praetorian Guard after only 7 months. Otho, who replaced him, committed suicide after losing one battle to the Rhine legions who had declared Vitellius emperor. Vitellius gorged himself on banquets, while the Eastern legions declared their general Vespasian. Vitellius was captured, dragged through Rome, and thrown in the Tiber. Vespasian arrived to find Rome bankrupt, the army demoralized, and the empire exhausted. Titus Flavius Vespasianus was a gruff, humorous, unpretentious soldier from the Italian countryside whose family had been wealthy enough to give him a good education and a political career, but had no aristocratic pretensions. He consolidated his power quickly, imposed financial discipline, and began the project of rebuilding Rome's finances, institutions, and physical infrastructure. Most visibly, he began work on the building that would become the most famous structure in Roman history, what we call the Colosseum. Formerly the Flavian Amphitheater, it was built on the site of the artificial lake that Nero had created for his Domus Aurea. A pointed political statement about repurposing an emperor's private luxury for public entertainment. The Colosseum could hold up to 80,000 spectators and was the largest amphitheater in the Roman world. Gladiatorial combat, the spectacle most associated with the Colosseum, had a history that predated Rome itself. It appears to have originated in Etruscan funeral rites, where combat between warriors was performed at the graves of great men, a sacrifice of blood to honor the dead, and perhaps send a warrior's spirit as a companion to the afterlife. The Romans absorbed this tradition and commercialized and expanded it enormously. By the time of the Colosseum, gladiatorial shows, called munera, were lavish productions involving dozens or hundreds of fighters, mock naval battles, animal hunts, and public executions. They were not solely displays of killing, but performances of skill and courage that Roman audiences took extremely seriously. Different gladiatorial types had specific weapons and fighting styles. The retiarius fought with net and trident. The secutor carried sword and large shield. The Thracian fought with a curved cycasword and small shield. Crowds knew the styles and could evaluate the performances technically. The gladiators themselves were a social paradox. Legally among the lowest people in Roman society, social outcasts who had surrendered their legal rights, and yet simultaneously, celebrities who attracted devoted fans, had their portraits painted, and whose names were carved in graffiti on walls across the empire. Some gladiators were condemned criminals, some were slaves, some were prisoners of war. But a significant number were free volunteers who entered the arena for the pay, the fame, and presumably the adrenaline. The life expectancy of gladiators has been somewhat exaggerated in popular imagination. They were expensive investments and were not killed at the first sign of weakness. A fighter who fell injured in the arena could appeal to the crowd and to the presiding magistrate for mercy with the missio, a gesture now associated in popular culture with a thumbs up or down, though ancient evidence for the exact gesture is unclear. A good show might result in survival even in defeat. To understand what the Colosseum meant to Rome, you have to understand how Romans thought about public life, about the relationship between the state and the citizen, between the powerful and the powerless, and about what entertainment was actually for. The Colosseum was not merely a stadium, it was a political institution. It was where the emperor displayed his generosity and power, where the people could express their approval or disapproval of public figures with a directness unavailable in any other forum. and where Roman values about courage, endurance, and the proper relationship between life and death were enacted in flesh and blood in front of 80,000 witnesses. Emperors who provided spectacular games were popular. Emperors who neglected the arena were resented. The satirist Juvenal famously reduced Rome's political life to the phrase panem et circenses, bread and circuses, meaning the urban poor had traded their political independence for free grain and entertainment. It was a sharp observation, but it undersold the complexity of the arena's function. The games were also where Romans processed their anxiety about death, their admiration for courage in the face of it, and their fascination with violence as a form of order-making. An execution in the arena was not merely punishment, but a public theatrical statement about what happened to those who broke Rome's rules. The world outside the arena was no less complex and no less worth understanding. Roman daily life, for the vast majority of the empire's population, bore no resemblance to the marble forums and palatial villas that have dominated our popular image of Rome. Most Romans lived in the insulae, the multi-story apartment buildings that packed the city's hills and valleys so densely that Rome was one of the most crowded cities in the ancient world. These buildings were typically 5 or 6 stories high, built of wood and brick, with the most desirable and expensive apartments on the lower floors and the cheapest, most miserable quarters at the top. Where the climb was exhausting, the fire risk was greatest since fire always rises, and the noise and smell of the street were inescapable even at altitude. Ground-floor apartments might have proper plastered walls, mosaic floors, and their own latrines. Upper-floor apartments were essentially single rooms shared by entire families, with no running water, no cooking facilities beyond small braziers that were themselves fire hazards, and no indoor sanitation. Residents of the upper floors emptied their chamber pots out the windows at night, a practice regulated by law but never entirely controlled, with the result that walking Rome's streets after dark required both a torch and considerable alertness about what might fall from above. The Roman day began before dawn. Bakers were at work by the 3rd or 4th hour of the night, and the smell of fresh bread was one of the first sensory experiences of a Roman morning. Unlike most modern cities, Rome had no public restaurants in the modern sense, but it had thermopolia in enormous numbers, essentially fast food counters built into the fronts of buildings, with large pottery vessels sunk into masonry counters containing hot food and drink. The excavations at Pompeii, the town preserved in volcanic ash after Vesuvius erupted in 79, have revealed an extraordinary number of these establishments, many with painted menus on the wall showing what was available. A typical Roman might eat a quick breakfast of bread, olives, and a cup of watered wine at one of these counters before heading out into the day. The Roman diet was heavily grain-based for the poor, supplemented by legumes, vegetables, olives, and olive oil. Fish sauce called garum, which Romans used with the same promiscuous enthusiasm that modern East Asian cooking uses, fermented fish pastes, wine, and occasional small amounts of meat. The wealthy ate considerably more elaborately, with elaborate dinner parties, the convivium, being one of the primary social rituals of upper-class Roman life. Roman dinner parties were famous, or notorious, for their length, their excess, and their social complexity. Reclining on couches arranged around a central table in groups of 3, Romans ate through multiple courses while slaves served food, musicians played, and conversation ranged from philosophy to politics to gossip. A good dinner party was almost as important a political event as a meeting in the Forum. The Forum itself was the heart of Roman public life, and its history mirrors Rome's own development from a simple meeting place to a monumental expression of imperial power. The Roman Forum, the Forum Romanum, began as the drained valley between the hills that served as a market and meeting place in the early Republic. Over centuries, it accumulated temples, platforms, basilicas, and monuments, until it became a dense architectural statement of Roman history and Roman values. The Temple of Saturn, the Arch of Septimius Severus, the Rostra from which orators addressed the crowd, the Basilica Julia, where legal proceedings took place. Walking through the Forum in the 2nd century was walking through 500 years of Roman public life, compressed into a single space. As the city grew, emperors added their own forum complexes nearby. The Forum of Caesar, the Forum of Augustus, the Forum of Trajan, with its extraordinary column, By the 2nd century, Rome had 7 interconnected forums, forming a monumental civic core of unprecedented scale. Roman religious life was woven into virtually every aspect of this public world. The Roman gods, the Dei Romani, were not a single systematic theology, but a vast and somewhat disorganized collection of divine beings accumulated over centuries from multiple cultural traditions. The Capitoline triad of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva sat at the summit of the official Roman pantheon. Jupiter was the king of the gods, lord of the sky, and of political power, whose great temple on the Capitoline Hill was the focal point of Rome's official religious life, the place where triumphing generals gave thanks and where the Senate met on the most solemn occasions. Juno was Jupiter's queen, patroness of women and of marriage. Fierce and jealous in the mythological tradition Rome inherited from Greek sources, where she appeared as Hera. Minerva was the goddess of wisdom, craft, and strategic warfare, corresponding to Greek Athena, patroness of artisans and of educated pursuits. Mars was the god of war, claimed as Rome's divine ancestor through the story of Romulus and Remus, and given extraordinary prominence in Roman religious life, since war was Rome's defining activity. Venus was the goddess of love and beauty, claimed through the Aeneas tradition as Rome's divine mother, and given particular reverence by Julius Caesar's family as their direct divine ancestor. But the Roman pantheon extended far beyond these major figures. Every place had its own genius, its divine spirit. Every home had its lares, household gods protecting the family, and its penates, gods of the storehouse, who ensured the family's provision. The crossroads had their own lares compitales, worshipped communally by neighborhood groups. Fields had boundary stones, sacred to Terminus. The hearthfire had Vesta, one of the most important of all Roman divinities, whose eternal flame was tended in the forum by the Vestal Virgins. 6 women selected in childhood from patrician families to serve for 30 years in a role of extraordinary religious and social prestige. Vestal virgins were among the most powerful women in Rome. They could pardon condemned criminals by meeting them on the street, had reserved seats at public ceremonies, rode in special carriages, and were treated with extraordinary deference by even the most powerful men. In exchange, they were bound to absolute chastity. A Vestal who broke her vow was buried alive, a punishment rooted in the idea that she was sacred and could not be directly killed. 2 such burials are historically documented. Roman religious practice was not primarily about belief or inner spiritual states in the way that Christianity would later define religion. It was about correct performance, ritual done right, the precise words spoken, the sacrifice conducted without error, the gods properly honored. The Latin word religio itself seems to derive from a root meaning to bind or to be scrupulous, suggesting that religion was fundamentally about careful, binding obligation to divine powers. When Romans sought the gods' favor for a military campaign, a harvest, a legal case, or a childbirth, they were entering into a kind of contractual relationship. I give you this sacrifice, these prayers, these correct rituals, and in return you give me success. Do utes, I give that you may give. It was transactional rather than devotional. This transactional quality made Roman religion extraordinarily open to foreign cults. When Rome conquered a new territory, the local gods were generally treated as real and worthy of respect, rather than as false idols to be rejected. The Roman practice of evocatio, calling out the gods of an enemy city before besieging it and promising them a better cult in Rome if they abandoned their people, reflected the belief that foreign gods had real power and could be usefully recruited. Over time, the Roman pantheon accumulated gods from across the Mediterranean world. The cult of Isis from Egypt became enormously popular in Rome, particularly among women. The Persian mystery cult of Mithras spread widely among soldiers and is found in military installations across the empire from Britain to Syria. Cybele, the Great Mother from Anatolia, had a temple on the Palatine Hill by the 3rd century before the Common Era. The Syrian sun god, Elagabal, was brought to Rome by the brief and bizarre emperor who took the god's name, Elagabalus, in the early 3rd century of the Common Era. Into this extraordinarily crowded religious landscape, Christianity arrived. and its relationship with Roman power is one of the most complex and consequential stories in history. Jesus of Nazareth was crucified under the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate in Judea, probably around 30 of the Common Era. The movement that grew from his followers was initially indistinguishable from a Jewish sect to Romanize and was treated accordingly. As a local religious phenomenon, in a province already notable for religious complexity and occasional political volatility, the earliest Roman mention of Christians comes from the historian Tacitus, writing about Nero's persecution after the Great Fire of 64, describing them as a sect hated for their abominations, who were already a large group in Rome by that date. What precisely Tacitus meant by abominations reflects standard Roman concerns about foreign cults that met secretly and were rumored to practice rituals offensive to Roman sensibilities. The Christians posed a distinctive problem for Roman religious tolerance because they refused the tolerance that tolerance required. Roman religious pluralism worked because it assumed that all gods were real and that participating in Roman state religion was a political rather than theological act. Burning a pinch of incense before the emperor's image was not a statement that the emperor was the supreme divine being. It was an affirmation of loyalty to Rome and gratitude for the peace that Rome provided. Christians, who held that their God was the only true God and that the emperor was not divine, could not in good conscience perform this act. Their refusal looked, from a Roman official's perspective, not like religious scruple, but like political disloyalty. The persecutions of Christians under Nero, Domitian, and Decius, and the Great Persecution under Diocletian, were not primarily motivated by theological hostility, but by this political dimension of Christian non-participation in Roman public religion. The Romans who encountered Christianity found it puzzling in multiple ways. The central claim that a man who had been executed as a criminal by a Roman governor had been raised from the dead and was the son of the supreme God of the universe struck educated Romans as both improbable and undignified. Crucifixion was a punishment for slaves and the lowest classes, designed to be maximally degrading. The idea of worshiping someone who had died on a cross was, to Roman sensibility, as if someone today proposed worshiping a man who had been executed by lethal injection in a prison. The Christian answer, that God had chosen this degradation deliberately as part of a plan for universal salvation, was a theological move that upended Roman value hierarchies in ways that were either profound or offensive depending on one's perspective. And Christianity's claim that this salvation was available to slaves, foreigners, women, and the poorest and most marginal members of society on equal terms with the wealthy and powerful was either deeply egalitarian or deeply subversive depending on what position in Roman society you occupied. It was this combination, the universal offer of salvation, the tight community of mutual support, the absolute moral demands, and the promise of eternal life, that made Christianity grow despite intermittent persecution, and it was Constantine's conversion in the early 4th century that transformed it from a persecuted minority into the religion of the Roman state, with all the consequences that implied for both Christianity's internal development and Rome's cultural trajectory. When the empire became Christian, it brought with it the organizational habits of centuries of imperial administration. The Church adopted the Roman diocese as its administrative unit. It organized its hierarchy along lines familiar from imperial bureaucracy. It used Latin as its language of worship and scholarship. And when the Western Empire collapsed, the Church inherited much of its infrastructure, its administrative routines, and its claim to universal spiritual authority. The Bishop of Rome, the Pope, claimed a primacy over other bishops that mirrored in spiritual terms the primacy Rome had claimed over other cities in political terms. The army that had built and maintained this empire was one of the most remarkable military organizations in human history, and understanding it is essential to understanding how Rome worked. The Roman legion of the early imperial period consisted of approximately 5,000 to 6,000 men, all Roman citizens, organized into 10 cohorts, with the first cohort being double strength and serving as the elite formation. Each legion had its own eagle standard, the aquila, carried by a specially chosen officer called the aquilifer. Losing the eagle was one of the most serious military disasters imaginable. when 3 Roman legions under Publius Quintilius Varus were ambushed and destroyed in the Teutoburg forest in 9 of the Common Era by Germanic tribes under the chieftain Arminius. The loss of 3 eagles was a trauma from which Augustus never entirely recovered. He reportedly wandered the palace at night calling out, "Varus, give me back my legions." The legions were supported by auxiliary units, roughly equal in number, composed of non-citizens recruited from across the empire and the allied kingdoms on its borders. Auxiliary cavalry, archers from Syria, slingers from the Balearic Islands, light infantry from the Germanic tribes. These specialist units provided capabilities that the heavily armed and drilled legionaries could not. When a man served 25 years as an auxiliary and was honorably discharged, he received a bronze diploma granting him and his children Roman citizenship. The army was thus not only a military force, but a citizenship machine, gradually extending the Roman citizen body across the empire's population. The discipline and training that produced Roman military effectiveness were severe and systematic. New recruits were drilled in marching, weapons handling, and the complex drills of formation fighting. They practiced with weapons heavier than those they would use in battle, building strength and endurance. They learned to build a fortified camp, the castra, at the end of every day's march, a skill that turned the Roman army into a mobile fortress wherever it went. The physical labor of campaigning was staggering. Each legionary carried not only his weapons and armor, but tools for digging and construction, food supplies for several days, and personal equipment. A total load of perhaps 40 kilograms. The Romans called the legionary a mule of Marius, a joke that was also a badge of pride. The road network the legions used and often built was itself a military asset of the first order. Roman roads were designed to move troops rapidly and to last. They were engineered with careful drainage, solid foundations of sand and gravel, and paved surfaces that remained usable in all weather conditions. The main arteries of the Roman road system totaled over 80,000 kilometers across the empire, connecting every province to Rome and to each other with a reliability that the ancient world had never seen. The economics of the empire were built on and around this infrastructure. Trade moved through the empire at volumes that would not be seen again in Europe until the early modern period. The grain supply alone was a logistical enterprise of remarkable scale. Rome's population of perhaps 1 million people required enormous quantities of grain imported primarily from Egypt, North Africa, and Sicily. Transported by sea in large grain ships and managed by a special official, the Praefectus Annone, whose job was ensuring that Rome never went hungry. Disruption of the grain supply was a political crisis of the first order. The urban mob was not patient about food shortages. Beyond grain, the Roman world traded in pottery, wine, olive oil, metals, glass, textiles, spices from Arabia and India, silk from China, reached the empire along what we now call the Silk Road, amber from the Baltic, and slaves from everywhere. The slave economy was perhaps the most morally troubling aspect of Roman civilization, and also the most foundational to its material prosperity. By the height of the empire, perhaps 1/4 to 1/3 of Italy's population were enslaved, and the proportion in some of the wealthier provinces was significant as well. Slaves worked in every sector of the Roman economy, from the brutal conditions of the mines where life expectancy was measured in years, to agricultural labor that was barely better, to domestic service that could range from arduous to relatively comfortable, to skilled work as craftsmen, physicians, accountants, tutors, and even business managers who ran enterprises for their owners with considerable autonomy. The most educated Greek slaves were sometimes more cultured than their owners and were valued accordingly. A skilled Greek doctor or a talented Greek tutor could be worth many times the price of an unskilled agricultural worker. But the legal status of all these people was identical. They were property with no legal rights. Their children were their owner's property. Their marriages were not recognized by law, and their treatment depended entirely on their owner's character. Resistance to slavery took many forms. Some slaves ran away, some sabotaged equipment, or worked slowly. Some managed to purchase their freedom over time, if their owner allowed them to save a peculium, a small fund of personal savings. Some slaves were freed by their owners, becoming freedmen, liberti, who owed ongoing social obligations to their former owners, but were legally free, and whose children were full citizens. Freedmen ran many of the empire's commercial enterprises, and some, like the freedmen who ran the imperial secretariat under Claudius, accumulated extraordinary power. And sometimes slavery produced the kind of resistance that Roman society feared most: organized violent revolt. The most famous slave revolt in Roman history began in 73 before the Common Era, when a Thracian gladiator named Spartacus broke out of a gladiatorial training school at Capua with about 70 followers. Within months, his force had grown to tens of thousands, potentially 60 to 100,000 at its height, composed not only of escaped slaves but of desperate rural poor who joined a movement that seemed to offer an alternative to their grinding existence. Spartacus proved a remarkable military commander who repeatedly defeated Roman armies sent against him. He apparently wanted to lead his followers out of Italy, either over the Alps to freedom or across to Sicily, but his forces would not leave, and he eventually turned back south. He was killed in battle in 71 before the Common Era, when the Roman general Crassus finally brought him to bay. 6,000 survivors of his army were crucified along the Appian Way from Capua to Rome, their bodies left as a warning. The revolt left no permanent change in the institution of slavery, but a permanent mark on Roman anxiety about it. Understanding Roman women is considerably more difficult than understanding Roman men, for the simple reason that almost all our written sources were composed by men, about men, and from a male perspective. Women's voices are largely mediated through male writers who were describing, praising, condemning, or categorizing them. What emerges from these filtered sources is a picture of considerable variation. Roman women of the upper classes were not, as was once assumed, simply secluded dependents with no public role. They managed households of considerable complexity, including the oversight of numerous slaves and servants. Wealthy Roman women could own property in their own name, a right that distinguished Roman from Greek practice and gave Roman women considerably more legal standing than their Athenian counterparts. They could bring civil lawsuits. They could inherit. They could participate in the social and cultural life of their class, attending dinner parties, watching games, participating in religious festivals, managing commercial enterprises through agents. Some became powerful behind-the-scenes political operators, as we have already seen with figures like Agrippina the Younger. The remarkable survival of private correspondence from Roman Egypt, preserved in the dry desert conditions, gives us glimpses of ordinary women's lives that are uniquely precious. Letters between wives and husbands discussing commercial transactions, the management of family property, children's education, concern about illness. These letters reveal people navigating daily life with the same mixture of practical concern and emotional warmth that we recognize as distinctly human across the millennia. And the preservation of Pompeii by Vesuvius's eruption, which we have mentioned in the context of Titus, gives us something even more extraordinary: an entire city frozen at a single moment. With its commercial signs, its graffiti, its household shrines, its furniture, its artwork, and occasionally the plaster casts of its inhabitants who did not escape, men, women, children, and even animals, caught in the final postures of their lives. Pompeii is one of the most profound archaeological documents in human history. A snapshot of a Roman town in 79 of the Common Era that tells us more about how ordinary Romans actually lived than any number of official inscriptions or senatorial records. What Pompeii shows us, among many other things, is a literate urban culture where commercial signs, political slogans, love poems, insults, philosophical quotations, and obscenities covered the walls of public and private spaces with cheerful indiscrimination. Roman graffiti is a revelation. Someone scratched onto a Pompeian wall, "I wonder, O wall, that you have not fallen in ruins, you who support the tedious writings of so many scribblers." Someone else wrote, "Successus the weaver loves the innkeeper's slave girl named Iris. She doesn't care about him at all, but he begs her to take pity on him." His rival wrote underneath, "You're jealous. Don't try to muscle in on someone better looking than you, someone who is handsome and is a real man." 2,000 years later, These anonymous people writing on walls are more immediately human than most of the emperors and generals whose official histories dominate our sources. Vespasian died in 79, reportedly joking on his deathbed that he thought he was becoming a god, a reference to the Roman practice of deifying dead emperors. His son Titus, who had won enormous fame and some notoriety by destroying Jerusalem and the Second Temple in 70 during the Jewish revolt, succeeded him. Titus's reign was brief but dramatic. In 79, Vesuvius erupted and destroyed Pompeii, Herculaneum, and several other towns around the Bay of Naples. Titus organized the relief effort personally. Then in 80, Rome itself suffered a devastating fire followed by a plague. Titus died in 81 after only 2 years, and his brother Domitian, who had spent his brother's reign chafing at his exclusion from power, became emperor. Domitian was a capable administrator and military commander who was also paranoid, domineering, and deeply hostile to any hint of senatorial independence. He demanded to be addressed as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, which was an extraordinary and deeply offensive step in Roman political culture. He persecuted philosophers, expelled astrologers, and executed senators on treason charges with an enthusiasm that eventually provoked the very conspiracy he feared. In 96, a group that included his own wife had him assassinated. The Senate, whose relationship with Domitian had been deeply adversarial, declared him a damnatio memoriae, a condemnation of memory. His name was chiseled off inscriptions, his statues destroyed. His acts formally annulled. It was ancient Rome's equivalent of unpersoning. What followed the Flavian dynasty was a period that the historian Edward Gibbon, writing in the 18th century, called the period during which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous. The Age of the Five Good Emperors. Gibbon's enthusiasm is excessive, and his framing is classically Eurocentric, but there is something to the claim that the century from 96 to 180 represented the Roman Empire at its most stable and, in some ways, its most humane. The five emperors, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, came to power through adoption and selection rather than the genetic lottery of dynastic succession. Each emperor chose his successor based on demonstrated competence rather than blood relationship, producing a chain of rulers of genuinely high ability. The philosopher Emperor Marcus Aurelius later wrote in his Meditations about how fortunate he was to have had such models in his predecessors. Trajan, who ruled from 98 to 117, expanded the empire to its greatest territorial extent. He conquered Dacia, the territory of modern Romania, in 2 brilliantly executed campaigns that are commemorated on Trajan's Column in Rome. A 125-foot spiral narrative carved in stone that remains one of the greatest works of Roman art and one of our most detailed visual documents of the Roman military. Trajan's Column shows legionaries building fortifications, crossing rivers on pontoon bridges, conducting sieges, and fighting the Dacians in meticulous detail. Trajan also mounted campaigns in the east against Parthia, temporarily conquering Mesopotamia before the logistics of holding such distant territory proved impossible, and his successor withdrew. Hadrian, who ruled from 117 to 138, was the first emperor to grow a full beard, apparently to cover a facial scar, but also possibly in philosophical emulation of the Greek philosophers he admired. He was one of the most intellectually engaged and personally energetic emperors in Roman history, traveling to virtually every province of the empire, personally inspecting the legions, and leaving a physical mark on the landscape that is still visible today. Hadrian's Wall, stretching 73 miles across northern Britain from the Solway Firth to the Tyne, marked what Hadrian decided was the effective limit of Roman power in Britain and demonstrated his determination to consolidate what Rome held rather than expand further. He also rebuilt the Pantheon in Rome, the building with the massive concrete dome that is still standing and is still the best preserved building from antiquity. And he commissioned the extraordinary Villa Adriana near Tivoli, a vast complex of palaces, libraries, theaters, and gardens that reflected Hadrian's passionate engagement with Greek architecture and culture. Hadrian's personal life was dominated by his relationship with a young Greek man named Antinous, the great love of Hadrian's life. When Antinous drowned in the Nile in 130, apparently drowning during a boat trip, though under circumstances that remain mysterious, Hadrian's grief was so intense and so public that he founded a city in Egypt. Antinous, in Antinous' memory, commissioned portrait statues of him that were distributed across the empire and had him deified. Hundreds of statues of Antinous survive, making him the most depicted person after the emperors themselves in the Roman world. Whether Antinous' death was an accident, a sacrifice he offered voluntarily knowing that oracles had promised it would extend Hadrian's life, or something more sinister has been debated endlessly. Marcus Aurelius, the last of the 5 good emperors, ruling from 161 to 180, was a Stoic philosopher who would rather have been in his study than on a campaign, but spent most of his reign fighting wars on the Danube frontier against Germanic tribes. He wrote his Meditations, a private philosophical journal in Greek, during those campaigns, as a series of notes to himself about how to live virtuously while conducting the business of a world empire. It is one of the most remarkable documents in human history, the private thoughts of the most powerful man on earth, wrestling honestly with his own failings and with the question of how to act rightly in a world of violence and compromise. He was deeply influenced by Stoic philosophy, which held that virtue was the only true good, that external circumstances were ultimately indifferent, and that we should live according to reason and our duties to the human community. He succeeded in being a genuinely good man in a role that had destroyed the goodness of most who held it. He failed, however, in one critical respect. He allowed his son Commodus to succeed him. Whether this was genuine paternal sentiment overcoming his better judgment, or whether the dynastic impulse was simply too strong for even a philosopher to resist, the result was catastrophic. Commodus was everything Marcus was not: physically magnificent and intellectually shallow, vain, cruel, and increasingly unhinged. He appeared in the arena as a gladiator, declaring himself the Roman Hercules, killing animals and occasionally disabled people who had been dressed as mythological monsters. He renamed Rome Colonia Commodiana and renamed himself to a long list of divine and heroic names. He was strangled in his bath in 192 by a conspiracy involving his household chamberlain, his favorite concubine, and the Praetorian prefect. And the murder was arranged when his concubine found her name on a list of people Commodus intended to have killed, which she had discovered when the list fell from his bedroom and was found by a child. After Commodus, the empire lurched through another period of violent instability before the Severan dynasty stabilized it, but the political culture had shifted. The army was increasingly the maker and breaker of emperors. The 3rd century would make this horribly clear. The period from 235 to 284, sometimes called the crisis of the 3rd century, was one of the most catastrophic in Roman history. In those 50 years, more than 50 men claimed the title of emperor, and virtually all of them died violently. The Rhine and Danube frontiers came under intense pressure from Germanic confederations, the Alemanni, the Goths, and the Franks, who had grown larger, better organized, and better armed through generations of contact with Rome. The eastern frontier faced a revitalized Persian Empire under the Sassanid dynasty, which had overthrown the Parthians in 224 and was far more aggressive and capable than its predecessor. In 260, the unthinkable happened. The Emperor Valerian was captured in battle by the Sassanid king Shapur I and spent the rest of his life as a prisoner, reportedly used as a mounting block for Shapur's horse. No Roman emperor had ever been taken prisoner before. The crisis was economic as well as military. The constant wars required constant spending. With no new conquests bringing in fresh revenues, emperors debased the currency, reducing the silver content of coins until confidence in the money supply collapsed, prices rose dramatically, trade contracted. Cities shrank, plagues swept through repeatedly, the population declined. The empire that Gibbon had described at its height was visibly coming apart. 2 men, in the late 3rd century, essentially saved Rome. Aurelian Emperor from 270 to 275 recovered the breakaway western provinces and the eastern kingdom of Palmyra by a series of brilliantly rapid military campaigns, rebuilding the unity of the empire so effectively that he earned the title Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world. Diocletian, emperor from 284 to 305, carried out the most comprehensive reorganization of the Roman state since Augustus. He recognized that the empire was simply too large and complex for one man to govern effectively, so he created a system of 4 co-emperors, 2 senior Augusti and 2 junior Caesars, called the Tetrarchy. He doubled the size of the army, rationalized taxation, tried with limited success to control prices through an edict that specified maximum prices for hundreds of goods and services, and reorganized the provinces. He also initiated the last and most severe persecution of Christians in Roman history, which lasted from 303 to 311. Attempting to require all Roman citizens to sacrifice to the Roman gods and to destroy Christian scriptures and churches, it failed to eliminate Christianity and was eventually abandoned. Diocletian retired in 305, the first emperor to voluntarily resign, and spent his remaining years growing cabbages at his palace in Split on the Dalmatian coast. When his former colleagues urged him to return and resolve the civil wars breaking out among his successors, he reportedly replied that if you could see the cabbages I have grown with my own hands, you would not dare to propose it. The tetrarchic system collapsed almost immediately after his retirement, replaced by a new civil war. The winner of that war was Constantine, who by 324 had made himself sole master of the Roman world. Constantine is one of the most consequential figures in world history, and his most consequential act was his transformation of Christianity from a persecuted minority religion into the favored faith of the Roman emperor, and subsequently, the empire. The traditional account, which Constantine himself promoted, was that before the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312, which he won against a rival for control of the Western Empire, he saw a vision in the sky of a cross with the words in this sign, "Conquer," and ordered his soldiers to paint Christian symbols on their shields. The historical reality is more complicated. Constantine's conversion was gradual and politically sophisticated, and he continued to use traditional Roman religious imagery for years after supposedly becoming Christian. But his personal support for Christianity, the Edict of Milan in 313, which guaranteed religious toleration, his construction of Christian basilicas in Rome and Jerusalem, his convening of the Council of Nicaea in 325 to settle disputes within the Church, and his baptism on his deathbed, all mark a fundamental transformation. The Roman state's relationship with Christianity had flipped from persecution to sponsorship, and the consequences for both Christianity and for Rome would be enormous. Constantine also moved the empire's capital. He founded a new city on the site of the old Greek city of Byzantium, at the crossroads between Europe and Asia on the Bosphorus, and named it, with characteristic modesty, Constantinople. The city was consecrated in 330 and rapidly grew into a genuine rival to Rome in size and splendor, with its own senate, its own imperial administration, and eventually its own identity as the center of what the Romans continued to call the Roman Empire long after the western half had collapsed. The split between East and West that Constantine's new capital implicitly acknowledged became formal after the death of Theodosius I in 395, when the empire was divided between his 2 sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west. The west was in considerably worse shape. The Rhine frontier had been under severe pressure since the late 3rd century, and in 376, a crisis had occurred that set in motion the chain of events leading to the Western Empire's collapse. The Visigoths, a Gothic people from the Danube region, were fleeing westward from the Huns, a nomadic people from the steppes of Central Asia who had burst into the European world with terrifying violence. The Visigoths asked permission to cross the Danube into Roman territory as refugees. The Romans agreed, but then treated the Visigoths with such cruelty and exploitation that the Visigoths revolted. In 378, at the Battle of Adrianople, a Visigothic force utterly destroyed a Roman army and killed the Emperor Valens. It was one of the worst defeats in Roman military history, and the beginning of a process by which entire barbarian peoples would be settled inside the empire's borders, increasingly outside Roman control and increasingly armed and organized as military forces loyal to their own leaders rather than to Rome. The man leading the Visigoths in the early 5th century was Alaric, a Visigothic chieftain who had actually served in the Roman military and who wanted not to destroy Rome but to secure a permanent, recognized position within the Roman imperial system for his people. He wanted land and a military command title that would give him and his followers legal standing. He negotiated, he raided, he threatened, he negotiated again. The Western court, based not in Rome but in the safely fortified marshes of Ravenna, repeatedly failed to give him what he wanted or to defeat him militarily. In 410, Alaric's patience ran out. His forces entered Rome, spent 3 days looting it, and left. The city was not destroyed, and most of its people survived, but the psychological impact was staggering. Rome had not been sacked by a foreign enemy since the Gauls in 390 before the Common Era, more than 800 years. Saint Jerome, writing in Bethlehem when news reached him, could barely find words for his reaction. The city that had taken the whole world, he wrote, was itself taken. The Huns, who had driven the Visigoths into Roman territory in the first place, arrived in the West a generation later under their most formidable leader. Attila ruled the Hunnic Empire from the 432nd until his death in 453, and during his reign he conducted raids of extraordinary destructiveness deep into both the Western and Eastern empires. In 451 he invaded Gaul and was defeated, though not destroyed, at the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains by a Roman Visigothic alliance under the Roman general Aetius, possibly the last great Roman military talent in the West. In 452, Attila invaded Italy and devastated the north, before withdrawing, allegedly persuaded, partly by Pope Leo I, who met him in person. Though disease and supply problems almost certainly played a larger role in his retreat, he died the following year, allegedly of a nosebleed on his wedding night, and his empire rapidly dissolved. Attila's death did not save the Western Empire. It just meant the Western Empire died more slowly. The decades from 455 to 476 saw a parade of emperors who were puppets of various barbarian military commanders, the real power behind the Western throne. The Vandals, who had crossed from Spain to North Africa in the 422nd and established a kingdom that controlled the crucial grain supplies to Rome, sacked Rome itself in 455 far more thoroughly than Alaric had. The Vandals gave their name to the idea of mindless destruction, though they were actually fairly selective and spent 2 weeks systematically removing Rome's treasures rather than randomly smashing things. The final act came in 476. The last emperor in the West, a teenager named Romulus Augustulus, a name that seems designed by history for ironic resonance since it combined the name of Rome's legendary founder with the diminutive of Rome's greatest emperor, was deposed by Odoacer, the leader of a coalition of Germanic forces serving in the Roman army. Odoacer sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople with the message that there was no longer any need for a Western emperor, that one emperor was sufficient for the entire Roman world. It was a polite way of announcing that the Western Empire was over. The Eastern Emperor Zeno accepted the situation he could not change. Odoacer became king of Italy. Rome continued to exist as a city, but no longer as the capital of an empire. In the East, the empire continued, calling itself Roman, governing in Roman legal and administrative tradition, and for a few remarkable centuries, attempting to reclaim what had been lost. The Emperor Justinian I, ruling from 527 to 565, came closer than anyone to restoring Roman power in the West. His brilliant general Belisarius reconquered North Africa from the Vandals in 533 and then mounted a long and exhausting campaign to retake Italy from the Ostrogoths. A war that lasted nearly 20 years and left Italy so devastated that the peninsula took centuries to recover. Justinian also commissioned the compilation of Roman law into the Corpus Juris Civilis, a systematic collection and organization of the entire Roman legal tradition that became the foundation of European legal systems in the medieval and modern periods. He built the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, a domed basilica of such extraordinary engineering that when it was completed in 537, Justinian reportedly exclaimed, "Solomon, I have surpassed thee." For 1,000 years after its construction, the Hagia Sophia was the largest cathedral in the world. But Justinian's reconquests did not last. The Lombards invaded Italy in 568 shortly after his death. The Sassanid Persians took large parts of the Eastern Empire. The rise of Islam in the 7th century brought Arab armies that swept through the Middle East and North Africa with astonishing speed, permanently removing Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and eventually Persia from Byzantine control. The Byzantine Empire survived, shrunken but vital, for another 800 years after Justinian, finally ending in 1453 when the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II conquered Constantinople. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine VII, reportedly died fighting on the walls, his imperial identity stripped away as he became simply another soldier in the last Roman defense. The line from Romulus to Constantine XI is direct and continuous across more than 2,000 years, though what that line means, whether the Byzantines were truly Romans or something else entirely, is a question historians still debate. What Rome bequeathed to the world is so vast and so varied that attempting to catalog it completely would be an entire documentary in itself. The most obvious legacy is legal. Roman law, as compiled and systematized by Justinian, became the common law of the medieval Catholic Church, the foundation of civil law systems across continental Europe, and through European colonialism spread to Latin America, Africa, and beyond. The distinction between public and private law, the concept of legal personality, the principle of innocent until proven guilty, the idea of contracts and property rights governed by consistent rules. These are Roman contributions that shape daily life in dozens of countries without anyone thinking about their origin. The Latin language, which evolved into Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, French, Romanian, and through them gave enormous vocabulary to English, remained the language of educated Europe and of the Catholic Church for over a millennium after Rome's fall. When Newton wrote his Principia Mathematica in Latin in 1687, he was still using Rome's tongue to communicate scientific discovery across Europe's language barriers. When the Catholic Mass was said in Latin until 1965, it was said in the language of the legions. Roman engineering shaped the physical landscape of Europe so thoroughly that its effects are still visible. The roads Romans built were so well constructed that many of their routes are followed by modern highways. Roman walls became the foundations of medieval cities. Roman aqueduct technology was not surpassed in Europe until the 19th century. The Roman arch and vault, the Roman dome, the Roman basilica plan. These are the architectural DNA of European church and public building design. Brunelleschi studied Roman ruins to figure out how to build the dome of the Florence Cathedral. Christopher Wren looked at Roman models when designing St. Paul's in London. Thomas Jefferson modeled the Virginia state capitol on the Maison Carrée in Nimes, a Roman temple. Roman political forms and Roman political vocabulary permeated the governments that succeeded Rome. The Holy Roman Empire, which lasted from 800 to 1806, was a conscious attempt to revive Roman imperial authority. The Catholic Church organized itself on Roman administrative lines, with a bishop of Rome, the Pope, claiming universal authority in spiritual matters as the emperor had claimed in temporal ones. Medieval scholars divided history into a sequence of universal empires in which Rome held pride of place and from whose legacy the political legitimacy of their own kingdoms derived. Even the critics of Roman-style monarchy used Roman vocabulary. The American Republic, with its Senate, its consuls replaced by a president, its citizen soldiers, its republican virtue rhetoric, is consciously modeled on Rome as the founding fathers understood it, filtered through the 18th century's idealized image of republican Roman virtue. Before Rome fell, it created. And what it created, in literature, philosophy, architecture, and science, deserves its own moment of contemplation. Because the intellectual life of Rome is not merely a footnote to its military and political story, but is as vital and as lasting as anything the legions ever built. Roman literature was born in conscious dialogue with Greek models, and it took roughly 2 centuries to develop a Latin voice confident enough to claim equality with its Greek predecessors. The earliest Roman literature was translation and adaptation of Greek drama. The first Roman plays were translations of Greek comedies and tragedies, performed at the games during religious festivals, and they established a tradition of theatrical performance that would eventually produce Plautus and Terence in comedy, writers whose plots were borrowed from Greek originals, but whose language, character types, and social observation were distinctly Roman. Plautus in particular had a gift for vernacular humor, for the language of street and slave quarters, that gave Roman comedy an energy and earthiness surviving in its enormous influence on later European drama. Shakespeare's Comedy of Errors draws directly on Plautus. Terence, writing in more refined Latin for a more sophisticated audience, explored the social tensions of the 2nd century before the Common Era with a psychological subtlety that caused Julius Caesar, who knew something about character observation, to call him a lover of pure speech, puri sermonis amator. The late Republic produced the two writers who would most permanently shape the Latin literary tradition, Cicero and Caesar's contemporary Catullus. Catullus was a young man from Verona who came to Rome and fell destructively in love with a woman he called Lesbia, whose real identity was almost certainly Clodia, the brilliant and notorious sister of one of Caesar's most dangerous political enemies. The poems he wrote about this affair, ranging from ecstatic devotion to bitter invective as the relationship curdled, are among the most immediate and psychologically real love poems in any language. His famous two-line poem, Odi et amo, I hate and I love. You might ask, how that can be. I don't know, but I feel it happening, and its agony captures something about the experience of passionate ambivalence that has been resonating with readers for 2,000 years, because it describes something that remains true about human experience. Cicero was both the greatest prose stylist Rome produced and one of its most consequential political figures. His speeches defined what Latin oratory at its highest level could be. His philosophical works, translated or adapted from Greek Stoic and academic sources, made the key concepts of Greek philosophy available in Latin for the first time and created the Latin philosophical vocabulary that would be used by medieval scholars and continues to shape Western philosophical language. Words like quality, quantity, essence, and definition entered the Latin philosophical lexicon through Cicero's translations. His letters, of which hundreds survive, are the most extensive private correspondence from the ancient world, and give us an intimate window into the political and social life of the late Republic that no other source approaches. Cicero is also perhaps the most useful illustration of what the collapse of the Republic meant in human terms. A man of extraordinary intelligence who genuinely loved the Republic, watched it disintegrate, was unable to prevent it, and died for his opposition to its destroyers. The Augustan age produced what most Romans and many modern readers considered the height of Latin literature. Virgil, Horace, Livy, Ovid, Propertius, Tibullus, a generation of writers working under Augustus's patronage, through his literary administrator Maecenas, who created works of such technical accomplishment and cultural ambition that they became the canonical texts of Roman education and through Roman education of European civilization for nearly 2,000 years. Virgil's Aeneid, written over the last decade of his life and left unfinished at his death in 19 before the Common Era, was Rome's answer to Homer. It told the story of Aeneas's journey from Troy to Italy in 12 books of hexameter verse that deliberately echoed and competed with both the Iliad and the Odyssey. But the Aeneid was not merely a patriotic epic. It was a deeply ambivalent meditation on the cost of empire, on the relationship between historical destiny and personal suffering, on what Rome's greatness had required in human terms. The character of Dido, the Carthaginian queen who loves Aeneas and is destroyed when he leaves her to fulfill his destiny, is one of the most affecting figures in Latin literature precisely because Virgil gives her grief and her anger such dignity that Aeneas's departure, however divinely ordained and historically necessary, feels like a genuine moral wound. The poem keeps asking what all this greatness is worth, and the answers it gives are never entirely comfortable. Horace, a freedman's son who rose through education and talent to become the lyric poet of the age, brought the forms of Greek lyric poetry, the Alcaic and Sapphic meters he learned from his Greek predecessors, into Latin and made them his own. His odes celebrate wine, friendship, love, the countryside, and the acceptance of mortality with a combination of Epicurean lightness and Stoic equanimity that has never quite been equaled in any literature. Carpe diem, seize the day, from his first book of Odes, is perhaps the most quoted phrase from antiquity, though the full context is typically lost. Nunc est bibendum, now we must drink. Carpe diem. Quam minimum credula postero, seize the day, trusting as little as possible in the next. It is advice about how to live in the face of death, not a slogan for hedonism. Ovid was the enfant terrible of Augustan poetry, a brilliantly witty writer who pushed the limits of what Augustus's moral reform program was prepared to tolerate and eventually exceeded them. His Metamorphoses, 15 books of mythological stories organized around the theme of transformation, is perhaps the single most influential work of classical literature for the subsequent European tradition, having been the primary sourcebook for hundreds of artists, writers, and composers from the Middle Ages onward who wanted stories from classical mythology. But it was his Ars Amatoria, the art of love, a delightfully cynical guide to the pursuit of sexual conquest, that contributed to his exile by Augustus in aid of the Common Era to Thomas on the Black Sea, where he spent the remaining 10 years of his life writing bitter and moving poems of longing for Rome. What exactly Augustus found offensive about a poem that had been circulating for several years before the exile remains unclear. The most plausible explanation involves a scandal in Augustus's own family around the same time, the exile of his granddaughter Julia for adultery, and the poem's tendency to suggest that adultery was both common and manageable. Livy's History of Rome, written in 142 books, of which only 35 survive, was the great Roman national narrative, beginning with Aeneas and ending in Livy's own time. Livy was a Paduan, not a Roman by birth, and he brought to Roman history an outsider's admiration for the old Roman virtues combined with a writer's skill at narrative and characterization that made his history not merely a record, but a performance of Roman identity. His portraits of historical figures, Hannibal, the brilliantly dangerous enemy, Scipio, the noble defender of Rome, Fabius, the patient strategist, Cato, the stern conservative voice of old virtues, shaped how educated Romans, and then educated Europeans, understood Roman history for nearly 2,000 years. His history is not reliable by modern standards of evidence and source criticism, but it is invaluable as a document of what Romans believed about themselves and wanted to believe about themselves. The Silver Age of Latin literature, the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, produced writers who worked in the shadow of Augustan achievement, but sometimes transcended it through darker material or sharper moral insight. Seneca the Younger, Nero's tutor and eventual victim, wrote philosophical essays, letters, and tragedies that explored Stoic philosophy with an intensity and personal directness that reflected a man writing under constant threat of imperial displeasure. His epistles to Lucilius, a series of moral letters to a friend, discuss how to live well under tyranny, how to face death without fear, and how to maintain inner freedom when outer freedom is impossible, with a practical psychological insight that has made them perennially readable. Seneca knew something about these questions personally, having been exiled by Claudius and ultimately ordered to commit suicide by Nero. His death, which Tacitus describes in detail, was deliberately modeled on Socrates' death, a Stoic philosopher choosing to die well when life had become incompatible with honor. Tacitus, writing in the late 1st and early 2nd century, was Rome's greatest historian in terms of psychological insight and literary power. His annals and histories covering the period from Tiberius through Domitian are dense, ironic, deeply suspicious of power and those who exercise it, and written in a Latin prose of such compressed intensity that translators have always struggled to find equivalents for his effects. Tacitus watched the Senate of his own day accommodate itself to the reality of imperial rule and had no illusions about what that accommodation cost in integrity and honesty. His descriptions of Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero are portraits of power corrupting and corrupted, and they reflect a man who had lived through Domitian's reign and understood what it meant to survive a tyrant by keeping one's head down and one's mouth shut, while others were executed for truth-telling. Pliny the Younger, his friend and correspondent, provides a fascinating counterpoint. A man of considerable decency, who served the same imperial system with considerably less anguish, and whose letters give us intimate portraits of upper-class life in the late 1st and early 2nd century, including his famous eyewitness accounts of the eruption of Vesuvius. Roman science and philosophy are somewhat separate from Roman literature, but equally significant in their long-term influence. The Romans were not primarily original scientists in the Greek theoretical tradition. They absorbed and transmitted Greek scientific knowledge rather than generating much new theoretical work themselves. But Roman applied science, Roman engineering science, was extraordinary. The concrete the Romans developed, opus caementicium, using a volcanic ash called pozzolana mixed with lime and rubble, was an engineered material of remarkable properties that allowed the construction of large spans and complex three-dimensional forms impossible with cut stone alone. Roman concrete structures that have been underwater for 2,000 years are still solid, a durability that modern Portland cement cannot match, partly because of the way seawater reacts chemically with the volcanic ash to strengthen the material over time. The study of Roman concrete is now an active area of material science research with potential applications for sustainable construction. Roman architecture translated engineering capability into a built environment of extraordinary ambition and lasting influence. The arch and the vault, which the Romans refined rather than invented but developed to an unprecedented scale and sophistication, allowed them to span wider distances and enclose larger volumes of space than any previous architecture. The Pantheon, rebuilt by Hadrian around 118 to 125 of the Common Era on the site of an earlier structure, has a concrete dome with an interior diameter of 43.3 meters that remained the largest dome in the world for nearly 14 centuries, until the Florence Cathedral's dome was completed in 1436. The Pantheon's dome is a masterpiece of structural engineering that distributes its enormous weight through a graduated system of concrete types, from heavier aggregate at the base to lighter volcanic pumice near the open oculus at the top, creating a building that has stood for nearly 2,000 years without structural failure or significant repair. When Michelangelo saw it, he declared it was of angelic and not human design. The aqueducts that supplied Rome and the empire's cities with fresh water were engineering achievements of a different but equally impressive kind. Rome itself was supplied by 11 major aqueducts, bringing water from sources up to 90 kilometers away, capable of delivering over 1 million cubic meters of fresh water daily into a city of perhaps 1 million inhabitants. This was a per capita water supply roughly comparable to a modern European city. The engineering challenge of moving this water from distant springs to the city across varied terrain was solved by the Romans with remarkable precision. Aqueducts had to maintain a constant downhill gradient, typically around 1 in 4,000, across their entire length, requiring careful surveying and either elevated sections carried on arched bridges across valleys or tunnels cut through hills. The Pont du Gard, in southern France, carrying an aqueduct across the Garden River on 3 tiers of arches rising 49 meters above the river, is a Roman engineering structure of such beauty and technical accomplishment that it has never stopped drawing admirers. It was built without mortar, the stones cut so precisely that they fit together and hold by their own weight and geometry alone. The Roman road system, which we have mentioned in a military context, was also a marvel of civilian engineering and economic facilitation. Roman roads were built to last, and they did. Portions of the Via Appia outside Rome, the Queen of Roads as the Romans called it, are still walkable today on their original paving stones. The network connected not just the major cities but reached deep into the provinces, facilitating trade, communication, and the movement of administrators and armies with a reliability that no subsequent European system would match until the early modern period. Roman milestones, set at regular intervals along the roads with distances to the nearest major cities, allowed travelers to plan journeys with reasonable precision. The Roman postal system, the cursus publicus established by Augustus, using relay stations where horses and riders could be exchanged, could move official messages at speeds of 250 to 500 kilometers per day over good roads. Pliny the Elder, who died observing the eruption of Vesuvius from too close a distance, and who is memorialized in his nephew's letters as a man of insatiable intellectual curiosity, compiled his Natural History, a 3-7-volume encyclopedia of the natural world as Romans understood it. It covered astronomy, mathematics, geography, botany, medicine, agriculture, metallurgy, and the fine arts, drawing on several hundred Greek and Roman sources. Much of what it contains is wrong by modern scientific standards, reflecting the errors and misconceptions of ancient natural philosophy, but it is an invaluable document of what an educated Roman in the 1st century knew or believed about the natural world, and it remained an authoritative reference work in Europe through the Middle Ages and into the early modern period. Pliny's description of the eruption of Vesuvius, reconstructed from his nephew's account of what the elder Pliny experienced before his death, is the source for the term Plinian eruption, used today by volcanologists to describe the specific style of explosive volcanic eruption Vesuvius produced in 79. Galen, the Greek physician who worked in Rome in the 2nd century under the emperors Marcus Aurelius and Commodus, was perhaps the most influential medical writer of antiquity. His systematic approach to anatomy, based on careful dissection of animals since Roman custom prohibited human dissection, his pharmacology, his understanding of the relationship between the 4 humors and health, and his therapeutic practice formed the basis of European medical understanding for over 1,000 years. His works were studied in Arabic, translation by Islamic physicians, and then retranslated into Latin for medieval European medical schools. Until the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries, Galenic medicine was essentially European medicine, and even after, Galen's anatomical descriptions were often treated as more authoritative than direct observation of the human body when they conflicted, which caused considerable confusion until Andreas Vesalius published his landmark Anatomical Atlas in 1543, directly challenging Galen's errors. The reasons for Rome's fall have been debated almost since it happened and have never been definitively resolved. Edward Gibbon, in his monumental Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, published between 1776 and 1788, blamed Christianity for sapping Roman military virtue and diverting talent to the Church. Modern historians have largely rejected this explanation, though not the related observation that Christianity transformed Roman culture fundamentally. More recent explanations have emphasized the structural problems of maintaining a vast frontier with diminishing revenue, the destructive effect of political instability on long-term planning, the damage done by plagues to the labor force and tax base, the role of the Hunnic pressure that pushed barbarian peoples into Roman territory in numbers too large to assimilate, the failure of the Roman elite to maintain civic virtue as the system came under stress, and the possibility that climate change in the late antique period disrupted agriculture across the empire. Perhaps the most compelling observation is not why Rome fell, but how long it lasted. A political entity that maintained recognizable continuity for over 1,000 years in the West and over 2,000 in the East, that governed a territory stretching from Scotland to Mesopotamia, that created the administrative, legal, and cultural framework for much of Western civilization, and that remained, even in decline, sufficiently vital that its memory was invoked continuously for centuries after its collapse. This is not a story of failure, but of extraordinary achievement. The fall is real and dramatic and worth understanding. But Rome's remarkable longevity is equally worth contemplating. The Caesars and senators, the legionaries and slaves, the philosophers and gladiators, the women whose names history mostly forgot and the women like Cleopatra and Agrippina whose names it could not, the engineers who built the aqueducts, and the artists who painted the portraits preserved at Pompeii. All of these people lived and died in the certainty, or the hope, that their world was permanent, that Rome would last forever. Urbs Aeterna, the eternal city, was not just a phrase, but a belief. The Christians who eventually came to dominate that world had their own version of eternal Rome, the church built on Peter's bones beneath Street, Peter's Basilica, claiming the authority of the empire, but redirecting it toward a different kind of eternity. None of them knew they were building something that would collapse, be mourned, be studied, be imitated, and be argued about for 2,000 years. They were simply living, building, fighting, loving, arguing, governing, enslaving, creating, and dying, in the same ways that human beings always do. The extraordinary thing is not that Rome fell. The extraordinary thing is what Rome was while it stood, and what it became in the minds of every civilization that came after it and looked backward, past the ruins and the ruins of the ruins, toward the marble city on the 7 hills and the endless armies marching out from it toward the edges of the known world. The story of Rome is still unfinished, not because the empire still exists, but because its ideas still live, its law still governs, its language still echoes, and its vision of what a civilization might be still haunts every government, every legal system, every city built with straight roads and public baths, and gathering places where citizens might debate the common good. Rome is not ancient history. Rome is the mirror in which the modern world still sees its own origins, and the shadow it casts reaches all the way to here, all the way to now, and shows no sign of fading.